Hello everyone, today we talk about yet another hot topic considering the world's interests and figures and questions that have been going on in the last years, in the last decade, if you want, as I presume a broader consequence of the crisis that has struck the West more evidently than other places in still, however, a pretty tormented international situation for that matter. As you know, I never criticize the West in order to flatter anybody else for that matter. Just seriously concerned about the West, and as always, everybody should be for not just because of their personal background, but in general for also what certain universal values are concerned. And so I will discuss for the first time on this channel, which I wanted to do from quite a while, honestly, and you can argue ever since I started Schwerpunkt, but I hadn't had a specific reason up to this point. That is Jordan Peterson, and I think you know pretty well who I'm talking about. He's a prominent Canadian. He started, let's say, in his prominence as a YouTube personality. He's actually a clinical psychologist, a professor emeritus at the University of Toronto. So we're talking about one of the most influential and also controversial figures, at least the latter adjective. I will explain why. I think you know. I mean, it's mostly a political side that deems what he's talking about really and spreading knowledge or disclosing as controversial, which had in fact an astonishing success, just starting by uploading his psychology classes, university classes on the internet. Right, he is a PhD in clinical psychology specifically. And he also taught and researched at Harvard, etc. So he really wrote a lot of stuff, both academically and for the sake of disclosure. And I've also read something from him, and I think it's going to be pretty difficult to address everything I want in this single video. As you know, I can't talk for hours and hours. But really, the matter is more complex than it seems. And this video, also from the title that will hopefully be quite explicit and unequivocal about it, is albeit a criticism to his thought and mostly the reception of it and the broader context of within this dynamics happen, but also the causes properly of, as far as I understood, also properly looking at his background, at the influences that he received in his curriculum, in his education, personal experience, are not meant, in fact, to be, to portray him in a negative light of any sort. As a matter of fact, I think that what he's been doing, that means traveling for years and years, I think almost every day continuously, with his wife to across all countries in the world, basically discussing his ideas, right? His theories has been an enormous achievement, right? That is the testament, let's say, to his own beliefs. That, right? Quite concretely, his whole point is to find essentially a universal meaning, right, that can make morality and science collimate in a sense. This is at least my interpretation of the whole thing. I don't know whether he would phrase it and term it in this way, because much of his thought, and I'm not really a fan of this thing, has been in a sense manipulated as to oppose, let's say, science and religion in a way. And you know that I'm also quite vocal about the positivity in the role that religion has, tradition has, the hierarchy, the value of civilization in this pattern, right, of authority, discipline, clarity, rationality, and especially the idea of self-development and this tension towards an absolute in a way. And Peterson, I must say, influenced me as well, right? For few time, I think it could have been 1 year back in my, it was already in the second half of my 20s, did have some influence in my idea, especially this sense of purpose, of meaning, that here's some of these key, let's say, punchlines have always been, start by tidying up your room and then try to tidy up the world gradually by every day struggle, effort, just doing something more every day, and finding that doing that you will essentially look at life in a more positive light. This will not, will gradually undermine depression and the motivation, and at least depression not in the strictly clinical sense, which is a serious thing, and in fact he investigates and spends a great deal of talking about. But there is fundamentally this idea that is definitely re-emerging much, especially as I've seen in American conservatism, that is also about mental illnesses and this space of mind. Yesterday we're just making properly a video about how idealism was removed by Marxism in Western academies after World War II, and how that the disastrous impact this had in people's psyche, and how they were effectively manipulated. Also many conservatives that still think, sometimes even following Peterson, that they got it. They actually haven't gotten anything, and that's the main problem that I think also with, again, I don't want to criticize the figure, but still, there is so much more that could be said. And especially spacing in fields that I can't space just because I'm a historian and especially a polemologist, but I did get interested very much also in, I can say psychology formally speaking, but through the archetypes, mythology, that also the same religion, theology, that Peterson visits so much, but still in a different way, in a different light. He always had more a psychoanalytic approach to that. Psychoanalysis, telling the truth nowadays, is not that big thing anymore, right? And we are discovering so much in psychiatry just through genetics and other fields, and we are of course very thankful for that. But this doesn't mean, of course, that psychoanalysis in the even autonomous right sense that is inquiring, asking yourself, speaking, right, articulating a speech. Peterson is quite eloquent, as you know, and he rightfully sees a lot of properly function and power and potential in being able to articulate a speech effectively, to lay out your thoughts clearly, rationally, logically. That is a big deal. Many people are frustrated, as a matter of fact, because they can't in many ways, and I think that even if I have probably a more intellectualistic idea, or at least of some aspects of the problem, surely I agree that there is, in fact, an enormous role played properly by the capacity of expressing, because that means properly starting to get that meaning and knowing how to articulate that, because otherwise we know things, it's just sometimes by not conceptualizing, by not rationalizing them and expressing them, they remain buried within ourselves and do not blossom and do not make us grow as we should. It's impossible to present Peterson just in such a few words, and I also forget so many things that I'm just thinking about while speaking. Now I've probably missed already 2 or 3 that I wanted to address. But to make the long story short, I think that great part of what I've been... yes, I was talking about my influence from him. Say I've been influenced mostly in this regard, yes, in the idea of... especially, let's say that the greatest influence I received through Peterson is the one of Jung, right? I never really studied Jung in... thoroughly, or had a specific interest in it, but indeed there is very much in the principle of individuation and in the realization that we have to fight with our own inner dragon in order to properly solve our problems. We should pursue that degree of suffering in order to achieve that, because without that, fundamentally, we can't have any any chance to be better people or to move on. And worse than that, Jung tells that doesn't matter how much you try, but fundamentally to try to forget, let's say, but until you don't solve the problem, this problem will not just remain there, but will fundamentally become greater and greater, and the more you go on in everything you do, because it will fundamentally spread like a tumor fundamentally in everything you do, and will at some point force you to confrontate with it, unless you break, or in fact something even worse. So this idea of individual responsibility and of hard work and the pursuit of excellency, and the needs of hierarchies. Peterson in here has been heavily criticized by mostly the left, in as much as Marxism, generally speaking, cultural Marxism, at least those who pretend, as explained, to be communists, really look at Western civilization today. This is a concept that has spread chiefly in a worrying scale in the United States. I would say in Europe we haven't quite bought into the stuff concretely, right? Communists have always been everywhere in this reality, but I think that great part of the unaddressed issues that are present in such a large and complex and important countries like the US is, let's say, explains a lot about also the ease with which such ideas, or it's even too much to call them ideas, frankly, but let's say would have such fertile ground on this. In recent videos I've been talking about this, incidentally, the fourth state, the idea that even what we've seen in the Indo-European mythology, that presents us with this archetypal, universal archetype, fundamentally, of the rulers as the clear, strong, brave, intelligent, capable, crafty, open-minded, true, honest individuals that crush the fatalist, the blind rage and emotionalism and weakness and kind of Dionysian hubris, and they are connected indeed, importantly, in they cannot be eliminated as a dichotomy, but they also reflect men and women respectively. This is a deep concept because Peterson, naturally, as a psychologist, has been influenced by also many researchers, in human sex differences, in mate selection. That's a big topic because, as you know, Peterson had this striking success, which he often, questioned the reason of, in a sense, among mostly young males, right? There is this idea that fundamentally post-60s, 70s Western culture and the spread of second wave feminism, at least, there is really not, in my opinion, a root difference in the mistake, right? There is not like such a thing like a good first wave feminism or anything, right? Anything like masculinism and feminism are essentially for culturally underdeveloped people. But let's say the prevalence that feminism assumed, like given for granted, the most radical instances, at least of it, that is, there should be a perfect parity in sexes. I will never use the term gender in this sense because it doesn't, I don't believe in it, and it has nothing to do with, distinguishing the difference between sex and gender. It's properly realizing that gender is modeled over sex, and so, you can't make moral relativism and how much you like, but even in there, why are you even using the terms in the first place? There is so much disorientation that I think that not even Peterson has ever addressed, but the idea is that masculinity has been repressed, and that has been fundamentally this as a part of Marxism, generally speaking, depleted, the sense that we've seen it in the video about the Soviet abomination of humanity, properly, that the ultimate goal is depriving both men and women of their sexual nature, so that their sole purpose would be to obey whichever ideology they're brought under without any kind of resistance of any kind. And this goes for the same criticism of so-called capitalism and faith and religion and tradition and hierarchies and all this stuff, and that especially has allegedly hit men. I have an explanation for this. I'm personally not very these are some of the criticism. I'm not very sympathetic towards the idea that men at this point should just blame feminism as such. I believe in the fact of the universal values of these ideas, meaning that feminism is bullshit. Why should masculinity feel threatened by that if, masculinity hadn't already problems on its own, right? Our problem, as I explained also in yesterday's video, this same goes for religion, for everything. It's not the problem, let's say, the spread of this leftistic ideologies is not the cause of the decline of our civilization, but just a consequence of it. There are much deeper, more universal and individual reasons why we have already given up, and so I think that this counterculture that has essentially developed also within the following of figures like Peterson or some American conservatives, more politically oriented, etc., is that there's this big threat that we have to fight. And in my opinion, right, if you are a person that is already mature, strong, safe, properly confident and capable, these problems simply melt in front of you, right? I don't think they are real problems. If you start thinking they are real problems because you fear that you can be overwhelmed by them, it means that you automatically have already lost the necessary faith to simply say, I'm superior. And so you have already lost the initiative, the offensive, and therefore you have already decided yourself to be the defeated in a way or another. So as a consequence, really, what I dislike mostly, not about Peterson's ideas, but much of the hype that has been developing after that by people who listen to these ideas, understand just the most primitive, superficial, simplistic, and meaning it very often deforming it on their base, right? Whatever they believe. It's something that happens also with my videos, for example, that I was talking about before, right? People are not most of the times really interested in what I say. They just care about the fact that they understand that I'm basically a conservative myself, that I make topics about history and peoples and ethnicities and religion, and so they say, this is our guy, so they project on me all the ideas they own, but ideas that cannot contain fundamentally what I'm actually talking about, because they are dramatically narrow in nature and have nothing really to do with what I'm talking about. So Peterson is very frustrated about this too, I guess, as any, there is no such thing like a univocal interpretation of everything, and we should be thankful for that, because that proves the impossibility of things like single thought, right? So even that's why I reject all this bullshit, like, of people that see conspiracy theories now and the evil, wicked West dominated by transgenderism, leftism, Marxism, etc., that, are destroying Western civilization. If you are Western civilization, these things cannot overrun you, right? The reason is that you suck, and that the reason you suck is the same reason why there is leftism in the first place from the other side of the aisle, right? So you shouldn't be flattering yourself too much, and should actually listen even just to Peterson better and understanding what that actually means. I don't believe that there is such thing like single thought, because single thought is physically, even before neurocognitively, impossible to attain, right? So if you need to sclerotize your mind thinking that somebody is imposing you single thought, you simply have no idea of what this thing is. You have no idea of what totalitarianisms actually are, because they're never, as political or social realities, an actual enforcement of single thought, because single thought doesn't even exist at the top of those totalitarianisms, and that's also the reason why they collapse, right? And there is no mean to attain. So already to have lost this offensive capacity, in my opinion, has to do even with the way Peterson content is delivered. And sometimes, yes, I must criticize him for not getting much to the point of it all, right? So they're getting a bit more in medias res. The main problem that I have outlined. I made a video, for example, last autumn, it was either September or October, that was actually about commenting Ben Shapiro interviews of the Weinstein couple of evolutionary biologists that in this sense are close to also what Peterson investigates in a way, pointing out how, let's say, in most of these, in the realization of the repression that is indeed taking place in many let's say, centers of education against traditional ideas or simple evolutionary biology, because any kind of pre-arranged, let's say, inheritable characteristic or difference between individuals is being fundamentally, on the basis of sex, for example, and that was the case, is being denied by radical leftism and radical moral subjectivism and so on, is failing because it comes from all different specialists of the sector that, however, are specialists of the sector and very often do not have an interest or a care or any let's say, perspective, broadly speaking, on other topics that and subjects and mindsets and philosophies and sciences that say scientific fields that would actually help them connect the dots. This is a huge problem, and it's, as I was saying before, the reason why this is has started from the United States is the same problem for which the same, very often American, but this happens also in Europe, academics are the same product of the academic environment from which those same leftism is spreading, and the same disorientation that you find among in fact, I don't know, it could be an evolutionary biologist, for the sake of an example, that cannot reconnect what is happening on a broader, for example, historical fashion, in a political, international, social way, and just speaks from a evolutionary biological perspective without even feeling the need to express, to research further, is the product of hyperspecialization, is the same reason why so much moral relativism has been injected by cultural Marxism in universities, because it can afford to do it in the absence of a cultural resistance that fundamentally is being destroyed. It's been abated since the 60s, the 70s, where in fact there's been a collapse also in the academic quality of these centers. The self-referentiality of a large part of the Western world academic institutions, etc., is part of the same reason why these institutions have been overrun by such radical ideologies, and the same disorientation again of those who get expelled from these places because they try to say something against such pressure is in a way the obvious consequence of that. Okay, let's not care about the fact that we have abandoned in a way tradition and fate, and we have decided to at some point just pretend that our Western prosperity would depend just on things like exclusively scientific subjects and just pretending it was about a matter of standard quality of life, as if these would just self-replicate themselves, I don't know, with an increase in wealth, for example, and they didn't depend on much more crucial moral questions that I think we are witnessing today, as the same problem is being posed that are unitly a threat. Peterson talked, they're not a threat by themselves. I believe that, of course, a culture or civilization flourishes in the moment in which it is prosper, in which there is material wealth, right? It's not that is a satisfactory condition per se, right? That helps a lot. I personally, I could have not studied so much or lived simply quietly and serenely and with comforts that I have if I hadn't had that money, right? And that stability and support, etc. But it would be ridiculous not to see this came from my upbringing, from my from my family background, from the place, in fact, I was raised in, properly in a historical sense. It could be nationally, culturally, etc. So it's a blend of both things, right? And you said, as I was explaining yesterday in that video about materialism, the spread of, why idealism has been purposely removed from Western academies, and fundamentally nobody has moved a finger to change the thing, and materialism has somewhat polluted by model the same mental, the same mindset of conservatism in the West that still fail badly, even if they claim, again, as if just claiming to be conservative and being hateful and resentful towards Marxist materialism, leftism in general, was just the only thing that you needed to do, right? Is properly not having, is the proof again of that this would be unavoidable, right? If you go listen to my videos from the past years, I have already talked extensively about this stuff, and I think that what is happening, what has been evident during COVID now with Ukraine, etc., is, I wouldn't expect them in the way they happened, but I was sure that they would have triggered some big change, because I realized that it was a system that was essentially in crisis, right? Not necessarily collapsing or anything, but let's say properly changing and shifting in ways that are dramatically dangerous, and that would correspond to what I would expect to this kind of end of history illusion effect of the Westerners thinking that everything would always remain the same, as if again, just being what we are is enough, without any other effort, just somewhat being born here and so on. This is part of the reason, again, why I'm so vocal also against ethno-nationalism, the alt-right, etc. And I don't understand why so many people get surprised when I say it, even though I make videos about Indo-Europeans and on things that would appear to be somewhat radically conservative, just because popular culture and actually the same leftism as a standard made them such. This has nothing to do with that. The same goes for Peterson. His ideas are fundamentally, in my opinion, I would, to me, Peterson just on a political spectrum would be fundamentally a liberal, right? To me, he's not at all. That is being criticized, saying he's alt-righter, white supremacist, whatever. He joked, saying the same day they called me kind of a Jewish slave or an anti-Semite at the same time, right? That kind of complete more disorientation. Left is not better at all. That's why I think it's ridiculous that conservatives complain about the fact that there is such a West, and they feel they're just declaring their own moral inferiority by acting like the victims. Right? If you are a conservative, if you have any Western value, you're constantly on the offensive. You don't fear anybody. You don't act like a passive-aggressive squish, like Fox News conductors, show in their videos just to be sarcastic and really doing nothing about trying to change anything. Right? Just blaming somebody and really not taking individual responsibility of doing something and making the actual change. That's it from a Clausewitzian perspective, morally, politically, strategically. It's one of the greatest declarations of radical moral inferiority, properly, that you can display in so many ways, and that's why I think Peterson has been also too lenient in a way in towards the. He is a gentleman. He has he's a charming figure. He's I would say. Of course, he's become famous thanks to his ways, his dialectics. He's obviously he's a cultured individual and so on. He could not be like properly a political activist, as we could define it in a radical sense. But I think that in his pursuit of meaning, right, and there is even a YouTube channel that is a sort of spin-off of his own. That re-elaborates his videos, makes some, kind of fleshy summaries of his ideas. You can easily see how, in my opinion, his ideas have been, in a sense, I first of all, let's put it in this way. I agree substantially with these ideas. There is not something I can say, look, this person is doing something that, I personally disagree in. What I criticize, right, is let's say, the fact that he doesn't bring these ideas to the extreme, right? He's pretty aware of the fact in his also serious and dramatic and very personal, intimate search for meaning in God, right? As that is one of basically the central point, I would argue, of Peterson's ideas, because it's at the end of the day the central pivot of any moral scientific consideration in a universal sense, is how reaching the extreme, like when he claims, would dare say that he or she believes in God, right? That is a powerful and very intelligent remark, because it seems as if that that idea of being part of a special club of people who claim that they believe in something, whatever it is can be religion, politics, etc., makes them safe. Whereas this, if you actually believe in the truth, in the extreme, in the absolute, you can never be content. You can never even dare to claim that you actually believe in God. And in fact, that's exactly my same position. I came to know this, Peterson, just after I had elaborated these ideas on my own. I remember since high school, right? It's not very hard if you get interested in history, in literature, in philosophy, if you properly start toying with what really matters, really, at an utmost level. And yet, in this sense, I don't think Peterson, that is a very let's say, compromising individual, because he knows that, probably from his clinical psychological experience, that if you want to make somebody improve their condition, you have to, first of all, establish a communication, a dialogue, and therefore there is a contrast that starts, and you should give something, right? If you want this person to give you something back, and starting from there. This is true. This is a point that Peterson used also in all his ideas on relationships that are so definitely an enormously important topic nowadays, because of the difficulties that I guess we all face in these realms, and that. However, in this kind of giving too much to the other, sometimes does compromise too much, in my opinion. I am personally a very intolerant person, and that's part of the reason why I also bond with very few people. And it turns out that I bond only, however, with people that have my same level of interest, and or very often, mostly just my colleagues, right? When I even talk to girls, the few girlfriends I had, they were objectively above average intelligence, but at some point things would end, because you would realize these women had limits on their own. I was not really the person who would bring those relationships to an end. Sometimes I caused that I caused that actively. Another time it's just complicated. Another time it was just heartbroken. Another time it was rejected. But actually, two of these instances, I wasn't even, we weren't even together. But what I mean is that there is a compromise that also is rooted in the idea of suffering, and in the idea of not giving to anything to basically what you don't think is the best. That could be a terrifying idea, because you basically at that point would reject everything entirely. That would bring to self-annihilation, in a way. But in a sense, it also triggers, kind of unlocks within you a much greater potential and capacity and legitimate, sense of standard that you should not compromise about. I remember Peterson in one, I was mentioning even in the video I made the other day, there's a very speech he made, or at least an important participation he made on Australian television, at some point, some years ago, where there was essentially a political debate. There were many people from every side of the aisle invited there, and then there was an audience. There were questions back and forth. Peterson was the big guest, and there was this debate going on between apparently irreconcilable positions, right? There was this Australian politician who claimed that she was, I don't remember, she claimed surely she was an atheist, she was essentially a leftist, definitely, and she would be I think she wouldn't get to the point, because in most of these debates you would have liked to be there, to have been there, also listening to them sometimes. There are things you would say to her. She was not. She was an intelligent woman, and Peterson understood, let's say, the attrition that was inherent in the debate, and in order to, given that they were basically disagreeing on everything, at some point he would lean kind of hand towards saying, look, I think, for example, he said, I'm not anti-feminist, he said at some point, right? I think that there is something in feminist, feminist is good as much as, I don't know, we was talking about emancipation, civil rights, and things like these. My point, of course, is that you don't need feminism to have any of those fundamentally, and because it's just lunacy if you care for really equal rights, which doesn't actually even mean that at that point, as leftism mostly claims, that the outcome should be the same. But you don't need any form of feminism or masculinism for that matter. It's just a civil thing, and I was disappointed in that sense, because I personally, if you really would dare say to believe in God, would dare say that you can be that lenient towards such an ideology like feminism, that in this sense you don't picture in its radically, essentially wrong nature, right? It's like trying to compromise. I'm not saying they're the same thing, but it's like you don't compromise with something that is wrong, right? You don't just, if you have a dialogue with a National Socialist, you say, well, okay, I can't compromise in the sense that, okay, well, after all, there was something good in it, right? You have to explain why. Maybe if there was something good in what, a citizen of Nazi Germany did, as many did, like in the arts, in engineering, in science, whatever there were, that is a good thing. It has nothing to do with National Socialism. It's two different things. You don't compromise, right? And especially at that point, you will still be very firm in remarking that, in that case, feminism, as much as, again, I can't help, but I'm not really equating the two things as National Socialism, are intrinsically and radically a bad thing that causes damage, that causes literally people to essentially be miserable, even taking their own lives, or even, taking other people's lives, as a consequence even of the same presence of feminism, these ideologies. And I believe that the democratic balance is something too fragile not to be willing to recognize such. It should be the ABC, right, of just a moral education, to realize that you cannot compromise with these ideas if you care about the truth, right, whichever it is, but that we're all struggling to come closer to that. Nobody has, I give you that. We all make mistakes. I'm not criticizing radically Peterson for maybe just that word, because he knows perfectly. I know, as everybody knows perfectly well, that sometimes you can make mistakes. Sometimes you can say things that you don't really believe in, or that you're just maybe within a certain context. So that's why I cared also to present the context in a kind of an understandable way of why he was trying to compromise with this woman by saying, look, I feel what you feel, right? I understand where you come from with that, but I still disagree, right? And that's a very intelligent thing to do, because also a great part of Peterson's work is exactly about this, that if you really love somebody, you want somebody's good, you don't really that has nothing to do. That's something that many alleged Christians that of course understand nothing about Christianity actually buy into, that doing good means just doing good, like literally just spending yourself for the others, but in the sense that you just have to do you don't have to be right with them, you have just to be good, literally, in the sense you have to be nice. If you want really people to do, not to do to others what others would do to you. The point is that, I don't know, when I make a mistake, for example, I want to be corrected, right? And I want to be corrected brutally, right? When I went to, to school, to university, and all these things, I've always accepted scientifically accurate criticism. That is to say, you're doing wrong at this, and I explain you why, but you have to fix that so they can work well. Instead, I've always been allergic to criticism that was not criticism, it's just, annoying you and, targeting you personally and, trying to just to disrupt, in fact, their potential dialogue and, bond and cooperation that could have been achieved. But again, if you do something bad, you should be punished. And that means loving humanity. When humanity does something wrong, it has to understand that. And unfortunately, there can't be a way to make people understand them without enforcing that teaching, right? And this is what an increasingly amount of people, including conservatives, are escaping to. It's a radical moral subjectivism for which, and absolute freedom, that is essentially negative freedom, is being taken as, I do whatever the fuck I want. And the reason I can see easily is, just having grown up for a few decades in the world, is that, of course, where are all those kids that I remember when I was a child that, were, loud and disrespectful and wouldn't listen to their parents, and would make all the other, children and adults kind of avoiding them around and being false to them because they don't want quite to shout them, but they hope that they're cutting it as quickly as possible. These people are becoming have become already disturbed, complex, problematic adults. We know that I get from Peterson, for that matter, that if by 4-year-old you don't know how to behave in public, fundamentally you will grow up just with people around you showing you their fake faces, betraying actually the annoyance that you represent for them, and therefore growing distrustful and hateful and resentful, and just being more likely to be an asshole and a failed person and whatever. And when you look at the world around you, you cannot avoid to realize that that degree of lack of discipline and sense of authority and rationale is causing people to be ever less tolerant of any form of constituted authority, of order, discipline, in fact, and so on. And so you have basically sociopathic individuals, or at least people who you have to discipline, and that if you won't listen, you have to discipline the hard way. I myself had to discipline some people in my life. I wish they had not been in my life because they were just bypassers, let's say. But, there are people in the world that I, dramatically offended and also somewhat threatened because they were misbehaving, and that they were taught not to misbehave anymore. You should know, actually threw out 12 people out of the surrounding apartments because they were noisy, right? I didn't care about who were smaller than me, bigger than me, men, women. I didn't give a shit, right? Because when I have to sleep and work, if you don't make me sleep and work, I will make your life a living hell. And so I'm still here, and those 12 people had to move out, right? And so I personally am a great fan not just of how to enforce, not of authority and discipline and order, and respect also towards other people, but also to know how to enforce it. And it's no coincidence that I study things like violence by definition, as my field of specialization, as a military historian, as Clausewitzian, and as properly as a specialist in strategy and tactics. I understand in ways that, again, also connected with politics and society, that, let's say, maybe Peterson may have not known. And this is the interesting aspect of it all. That is, I believe that, of course, Peterson is influenced by his background. Interestingly enough, Peterson said, I remember distinctly, that he was coming in the area where he was brought up in Canada, from essentially a left background, right? There were the areas with, I don't know what the words, some important trade unions or workers, etc. He was actually influenced by that. I think he claimed at some point he was a socialist. And so that is quite interesting because, for example, I come from a background that is definitely not leftist, and I have pursued, let's say, my studies, etc., without the aim actually of reinforcing, I don't know, whatever my beliefs were when I was brought up, that were really not definitely alt-right or anything like that. We're just, conservatives in a idea of decency, of hard work or honesty, of rationality, of manners, of, just working as a purpose, having a family, and that's it, right? And knowing how to defend these values, even with your own life, if necessary, at the utmost thing. And this may have influenced me in a way. I remember that as all young people, like at the end of my, when I went to university, I mean, that's the age normally when you're more iconoclast. And so, yes, I was influenced also by left ideologies in general, right? I just got to learn them, to know them, right? And some of it was interesting to learn, and, it was helpful indeed. You cannot really be, again, just indoctrinate yourself into a right or left ideology, or you shouldn't be indoctrinate yourself into anything. You just should know things and do things, right? And so the more you're indoctrinated into something, essentially the weaker you are as an individual, because you basically don't build up that belief on your own. You're just trained to passively receive it, right? And then Peterson changed. He said, I don't remember now, I even listened to him, but I remember he changed his mind. He began to study, to read. He's fond of the Russian classics, like me, I could say. Russian classics had a great relevance in my youth. He, here I see from Wikipedia, says influences Dostoevsky, Neumann, who was a Jungian, then Nietzsche, Orwell, Piaget. Piaget was a cognitivist, he studied child development, etc. Then there is Solzhenitsyn, who is the one from Gulag Archipelago that Peterson is in love with, and is a great rant from a man who went through things like the Eastern Front, Gulag internment, cancer. I mean, all amenities that you can imagine can happen in a lifetime, and other like Buzz studying those sexual things and etc. And so, if these are this is in fact, he often quotes these authors, and not just them, of course. He's a person with an important cultural background, but this is essentially the pool, and you understand fundamentally here you're looking at men of letters, philosophers, psychologists, right? And there isn't much actually about for example, history. There isn't much about properly history of religion. There is not von Clausewitz. I think if Peterson was acquainted to such ideas, would be mind blown himself. This is my idea that has buzzing in my mind for quite a while now. That I think that all these Peterson said that, don't get me wrong about the history thing. For example, he's very influenced by totalitarianism. That is to say, he got thoroughly interested. I think that was the thing that changed much in his youth at some point, to get interested, let's say, in the darkest human experience, especially in suffering, but also from the side of the perpetrators, what brings to kill, to commit genocide, and all these things. And he often brings, fortunately enough, is one of the few scholars who really does this, the horrors, not just of Nazism, of course, and thankfully, but also of communism, to the fore, to show, mostly rhetorically, that is, look, this is what does happen, what can happen, right? Peterson is never understood whether I don't think he's necessarily pessimistic about the whole thing, but he speaks often of civilization, and so what we managed to build up orderly and with a coherence and a logic, etc., as a miracle, right? Considering the primitiveness, the violence, the destructiveness more than else, and the irrationality of man, right? And showing with examples from the 20th century, genocides, wars, etc., what this can substantiate itself in after all, in a very advanced stage of civilization historically. And that's, however, basically all where he tells historically. And I never listened to Peterson venturing in other historical realms, let's say, with examples from for example, the evolution of civilization itself. Or as a medievalist, I cannot help but notice it did really talk much about medieval history or medieval philosophy, for that matter. Not that it should, right? I'm not putting that at the center of it, but what I'm trying to say here is that he doesn't seem to have like a diachronic interest in the let's say in the historical development of civilization, which reflects, in my opinion, the normal, I would say, psychological background that he comes from, right? It's basically studying a bunch of ideas from different thinkers or sources that include also the Bible, mythology, etc., but really without understanding them at the deepest in their actual historical context, which I think is crucial if you want to give any substance to these ideas whatsoever. Right, this is typical, especially as far as I've seen. When I was brought up, you do study something like history of philosophy for 3 years, which means that you don't study philosophy like in most other countries is done. That is, one day you start talking about free will and say you look at all the various philosophers who said something meaningful about that. I don't know, Descartes, Aristotle, Plato, whatever, and then maybe discuss it or draw a conclusion. No, we did something very different. That is, we start from classical Greece, and we ended up, at least our professor made us end up with analytic philosophy. Fortunately, we skipped existentialism, all that kind of ethic degeneration, essentially, of philosophy. And that, in fact, I'm not sympathetic at all, and it has fueled much of also this kind of morally relativistic ideologies we're being polluted with now. And as a historian, I kept building on that. And as you know, and as we were explaining you yesterday as well, I have been studying, thanks to the Clausewitzian theory, thanks to Indo-European mythologies, thanks to military history, all across the board, chronologically, and consequently history in general, that is the political and social entities where these armies were coming from, and what the development of civilization has been, which I think for Peterson would be extremely relevant, because it isn't just, let's say, making this scientific standpoint of saying, look, we're just barely developed animals that managed to build what we built. Wow. Right, why don't you see how that happened, not evolutionarily, from a biological point of view? I mean, study that too, because I think it's very important. But study it historically, study it politically, study it militarily, study it socially, and see why and how these transformations occurred, and what they caused it, and why they happened, and what can actually bring to the cause. Because much of the debate that is also being triggered by Peterson's ideas, from a leftist point of view, that of course is very interested in canceling history, canceling the past, because anything that goes aside, out of the Marxistic boundaries from an ideological point of view should properly be removed in any form, religiously, culturally, literally, broadly meant. There should be just Marxism and this kind of absolute standard of lunacy of mechanism, according to which that is completely rigged. I don't know. And that studying history would simply show you that, right? In many ways, not just because communism failed or that can always come back as a pulsion of the masses, but understanding why this is the case, why it is not just because of Marx or Lenin, but why this is also from an evolutionary perspective, but especially from a political, social point of view or cultural point of view, why it happened, right? This is the effort that I'm personally making in my videos, and substantiating the need of why to see these things as basically an enormous failure and a derailment, let's say, of sanity and of education, especially of knowledge, of rationality, and why they happen. Because that would be extremely helpful to debunk it further, which is not saying, of course, studying evolutionary biology and actually teaching it would dramatically show how, of course, there are hierarchies. Hierarchy is better of how I think it's pronounced in English. Peterson was mocked at some point because of the lobsters thing, because he basically started to draw parallelisms between the neurological structure of lobsters and the one of human beings, as far as it was connected with the concept of hierarchy and mating, and what were the alpha lobsters and why they were chosen, and what all these things, and how this has many parallelisms among humans, which has been criticized by very lame even so-called scientists that were just saying, no, this is comparing apples to oranges. But as a matter of fact, it is true, right? And it is, of course, inscribed in the evolutionary need for communitarian interaction that, of course, is based on this idea of competition and prevalence, and therefore requires the need of struggling, the need of self-improvement, the need of having also properly a certain mindset, certain mental predispositions and or capacities or stimuli, etc., that bring you to be a different person rather than another. That is a completely different field. I'm no expert on, because I don't have a sound biological education or evolutionary one, but I trust that. I think, as a matter of fact, what we know, or what the thing I've been told, even just in my life, and the minimal, are actually reflecting this idea. And if this was just, my point is the following, just with for example, making a history of science and understanding why things have gone astray, for example, with the taking over of Marxism in some, especially scientific faculties, etc., to explain this not on this scientific field that is, of course, manipulated. Of course, there is not like a soul science, especially if you're talking about method, and there are extremely interesting things to discuss about this, because I thoroughly believe in science, because I believe it's the only way to sort things out correctly. The point is that I don't trust people in general, because I know they are faulty, and I know that scientific ideas are going change over time, and based not just of evidence, but how you can how you measure things. Let's say how you what methods you pretend to use. And I am a historian, that is to say, I don't start with from alleged hard facts. I have to build a base from scratch every time, which is something that makes me extremely sensitive to what is properly the method that is used, and how do you want to convince someone or somebody of something extremely more complicated and extremely more unframeable, like history, than like a laboratory experiment, which is something that history, given that happened for real, right? It's not something you have to discover, but you have evidence of, and actually a pretty structured one, including an historiography of people living even thousands of years ago explaining how things went. I think it's something much more of a proof, right, in order to understand really the path of civilization, than some theoretical ideas, sometimes mere speculations or abstractions, right? And there are atrocious mistakes that, of course, derive from the same debates, etc., because people lack a comprehensive historical education, which I think is central. It's really from the one without which you can set astray in the easiest way compared to any other. This is not to say that all historians are good, because hyper-specialization is also the problem even among us. And again, I do believe that's a great part of the problem. And I would like Peterson to get into, not given that he's very sensitive to the idea of properly of meaning, of something that we can formulate mentally, to look at much more in depth what actual mythologies really did. And this is the point that is, properly the wisdom of ancient cultures really was. And when I say these things, I also feel uncomfortable because I come from, let's say, a more of a structuralist and scientific background, from that I matured in my early 20s. So I know what are the tricks that a socioeconomically or, structuralistically influenced view of history is. And so the wisdom of ancient cultures, of course, in many ways, if we measure them from the scientific standpoint, that is knowledge of nature, that we have now, seems to us ridiculous because, of course, after World War II, but since the Enlightenment largely, we've been in the broader process of secularization that happened naturally throughout the centuries. If we have been stripped of the memory of what properly the meaning of tradition was, right? Things like religion, of any kind, right? It could be monotheism, it can be the pagan rituals, it can be anything. Normally in the scientific mindset that as we, millennials, we've been brought up in, seemed to us like something ridiculous, right? We would, the civilizers would look at, I don't know, wizards and shamans and say, oh, look at these savages, and, they believe in this bullshit and whatever. I'm also not particularly into, especially the most primitivistic ideas, nor I think that, of course, ancient cultures were necessarily, let's say, better or worse than us in a, because that is, it's not a moral judgment anymore, it's moralistic. I believe, of course, that people living at the time had much better reasons to live the way they did than we do now, right? So I actually believe, yes, that we are worse in that regard. But I don't do it because I believe that, but there are lots of people who buy into the idea, there were some deep, millennial civilizations who had discovered things that were this great wisdom. You know how much I hate, for example, the idolization of Sun Tzu as opposed to von Clausewitz, because really people who study these things and try to compare them are really trying to compare things that cannot be compared. And because they don't know, of course, the civilizational path that distances them, and so they're really, in this case, comparing apples to oranges. But when it comes to, let's say, the real, properly the root and meaning of, as you know, I studied mostly Indo-European religions at that point, you realize that there are things that overlap dramatically, not just with evolutionary biology, psychology, lots of things that also Peterson talks about that are strikingly, he takes different paths and they're somewhat more complex. This is a problem of modernity that it overcomplicates things. But if you really study Indo-European religions, you realize that, for example, they match dramatically well with the same Clausewitzian theory, which even though I suspect there might have been some continuity from traditional times right well into, that was whatever, 18th, 19th century Prussian mindset, really didn't know I hadn't had properly created on the base of military evidence and the connections with politics and society, which seemed to be incredibly accurate and strikingly precise in properly, even from a psychological point of view, in describing what it is that keeps together a community, or the reason why you have to fight a war, or what is the ultimate goal of man. So all the highest meaning that is in its that is something that nobody teaches you. As I was saying in yesterday's video, if you look at my post-World War II manual of history of religions, it's basically kind of a structuralist comparison between religions that doesn't even address what the ultimate meaning of these religions was. If you studied things that, yes, were written by crypto or pseudo-fascists in the 20s or the 30s or the 40s, you realize that, yes, there were kind of ideologues or whatever, but, when they produced with the actually religious historical evidence, they told you what was known and what is still known actually among anthropologists, historians of religion, etc., what the ultimate meaning of those religions was, and it was essentially a religious military ideal that I made so many videos on. and that I will not digress again, again in explaining in the details in the system, etc. But that again seems strikingly similar to lots of things. For example, Peterson talks about, which I doubt he knows. Right? I wouldn't be surprised if a person like Peterson actually knew, had read certain, let's say, black books that actually talk about the hardcore Indo-European beliefs, right? And there is nothing properly racist in those things, right? That's why I think Peterson would never actually tell you about them. But I don't think he read that, right? The only mythological, religious, literary, philosophical quotes he makes are fundamentally from the Bible and from Hellenic mythology, right? So what are the gold standards? Like in Western civilization, you study the Bible as a Judeo-Christian tradition. Then we have made of the Greeks somehow even their kind of monad, for which if we study, people think we study classical Greece, it's as if they were studying the same mythology. It's something extremely more complex that stretches along a much greater time, different degrees of evolution. It has nothing to do, actually much also of what we praise as Greek, let's say Hellenic rationalism, philosophy, all these things are actually a degeneration of some of those mythological ideals originally. So this is something, for example, that Peterson has never addressed, and if he knew, and he would find the actual diachronic meaning of and perspective to explain from, would probably discover a treasure of information about the same meaning and alterations and distortions of the same, right? His points from his great hits are, I don't know, it's first of all, the Judeo-Christian tradition is naturally very different from the Hellenic mythology that essentially was an Indo-European thing. The main difference being fundamentally that Judeo-Christian tradition consolidates more the necessity of a counter-alter to pushed idealism, which is a very realistic thing that also Indo-European religions did, but still considering the idealistic Uranic dimension as the most important, as opposed to the darkness of the Dionysian and the Chthonic, etc., that had to be kept under, which in terms of hierarchies is exactly what, frankly, Peterson should know about. That is to say, that there is even there a blatantly macroscopic sexual connection to, of course, the male dominator and the female subject, and the even the same idea of holy war, the rape of the heavenly maiden, the idea of the heroism, meaning to being able to tame the darkest demon of you that is female in nature, and to transmutate it in the goddess of victory that will raise your soul to heaven. Well, you basically will possess her in that sense. So it's a radically important idea that was literally at the root, not just of ancestral Proto-Indo-Europeans from the Caucasian steppes. We're talking about beliefs that flowed throughout the millennia, all through and permeated even the same Christianity. I mean, even the Judeo-Christian tradition, kind of stemming from a Semitic background, actually was heavily influenced by not just Indo-European ideas, but by itself, it had those kind of beliefs. Peterson quotes the Bible as if very often was just a story, but he, for example, I never heard him addressing the extremely complex stratification of the Bible, the enormous diversity and heterogeneity within the same. Some passages of the Bible are expressly polytheistic. Some, even the same traditions of the different view of God properly. As you know, there are two gods in the Old Testament that are product of two different realities. I'm not talking about all the New Testament, speaking specifically of the Old Testament. And there is naturally, in this sense, also the New Testament brings a different idea, and which is influenced also by other religions. It's a very complex thing we can't discuss now, but let's say what Peterson does in this sense that alarms me, I'm glad that he quotes the Bible and so on, but is that he probably doesn't see that within those texts there is the degree of change and transformation that if you study from a culture within their historical background would reveal you an enormous path that is not just a static, in fact, fixed idea or principle, as mostly conservatives and traditionalists want to make of the Bible, like a monolith that is just whatever is written in it is of the same value, of the same kind. It's an incredibly complicated, stratified text that you must understand in their context, and most of this is not, right? We have become almost like a meme generation with random quotes from the Bible, from without even caring for example, the linguistic aspect, that is whether the translations are linguistically correct. This is valid also for many passages of the New Testament in the first place, even when it's in Greek. There are certain Greek verbs and prepositions that if you haven't studied the language, you can't quite understand in the actual meaning. There are huge theological problems behind that. This is not really the point per se, but let's say what I'm saying is that Peterson makes of myths and religions kind of a pool for quoting kind of archetypal stories as if they were suspensed in a vacuum, right? And saying, look, back in times, these people already found out this. Yes, it is true, but the point is that they knew much more than that. Right, and much more than what most even Christians or Jews or any other theist or atheist believes today, because they've never properly heard anything of that. Right, if you don't know that angels are a demonic force that you have to tame to elevate yourself to God, etc., and you think just of it's you're basically lost, right? Angels, even in the way people have visions about, you can easily understand that they are just the modernistic, secularistic type of angel figures that mostly mentally deluded people pretend to see, because they properly, through their own ignorance, betray the fact that they do not know anything about those figures, historically, mythologically, religiously speaking. And this is the greatest lie that we're being fed about history altogether, and that we seem in this moment of crisis that would make us look back at these things, that somebody would realize. I personally realized these things almost accidentally, even though this stuff is really published, it's studied, there are people who were involved in that, but maybe, I don't know, they study only that, even in their case, hyper-specialize in that, but never, for example, connected it to the Clausewitzian theory, never connected it to this public debate going on in the Petersonian case, let's call it in this way. And the most important thing, again, is aside from all these philological, historical, literary aspects, philosophical aspects, and the possible connections with neurobiology, all these things, what is important, again, is the historical spectrum. That is to say, these ideas weren't created out there for no reason. There was a path of development of these ideas, if you want, even of decay from those times to today. And in order to understand how this happened, you have to study them throughout history all along. We could study, for example, how much the Indo-European element mixed with the Judeo-Christian one during the Middle Ages, what was maintained in certain environments, even from I studied knighthood, the development of knighthood. There is so much just in that shows you how gradually even civilization was built by taming the most violent individualistic element. It was kind of brought under a collective discipline that increased in power and built up great part of what Western civilization is, but through ideas and archetypes that we still live and kind of believe in, even if we do not know it, even if we have never heard of them, even if we are maybe the most atheistic or secularized people living on Earth, right? And so this great tradition has been completely erased from our mind, so that we are deluding ourselves that what we're discovering now in the early 21st century is this great knowledge that actually was there all along, up to a few hundreds of years ago, where the elites knew all these symbolisms, these meanings, these archetypes, and that we have destroyed to create fundamentally an alternative delusional mindset that has just, first of all, iconoclastically destroyed what was before, and that is now timidly here and there just rediscovering that, wait a minute, that stuff actually worked. This happened, of course, as I already explained, through the revolutions, to national statalism, through the unlocking of the masses, communism, socialism, the overflowing in this mass of Dionysian, undereducated, wild, emotionalistic, barbaric, violent, tectonic masses, diluted all what the elite and this kind of teachings and ideas were into this cauldron, where such ideas went lost, right? And that we're now gradually recovering in a way that seems kind of let's say that is too often confused from our perspective, as if this was reactionary stuff from a kind of ultra-conservative, oppressive system that wanted people without rights or whatever. This has nothing to do with that. And the main problem, as I explained very often in my videos, is that, fortunately at least, we have abandoned those beliefs, not because there was a civilization collapse. On the other hand, we actually became ever more powerful and even prosper than before. Peterson warns about the risks of prosperity. That is, essentially, we have brought down all the moral force that we needed to cope with a world that we didn't understand. It was extremely hard to live in, because scientifically we began to learn more on how to make things work, and as a consequence we have lost purpose and meaning. What we should do through the resources that we have at our disposal is to recover that meaning, which is extremely difficult though, because before we were obliged to have that meaning just to survive, to have that order, that hierarchy, that system of values. Nowadays we should do that, if you want, artificially, still as individuals, but let's say we're too lazy for that, because it's not technology, but it's just the idea that we have been fed with, that only what is material, intangible, physically speaking, is the only thing we should be concerned of. And so there is a radical rejection of these ideas, for example, from thinkers like Harris, that also Peterson discussed it with, that is kind of, from a leftistic perspective, kind of a hero of, the science guy who just interprets neuropsychology, all these things of how the mind works. Yes, how the mind works, but doesn't answer basically anything in terms of purpose. It just, tells you, oh, look, the brain functions in this way. You're basically tricking yourself all the time. Yes, and what are you going to do with that? Or are you just keeping to describe that? Where's the meaning that you're searching for? And that's what Peterson is actually asking. And these scientific-minded people are so radically traumatized by the and paranoia that the only idea that what Peterson is actually saying, that there could be a meaning that was not, let's say, it's not alternative to science, but actually collimates with science, and it is exactly, as I was saying before, what I found out myself by studying those religions and those cultures, that was obvious on a political, military, or social grounds why they were using, and that today we have lost completely track of, and that since we can't understand anymore, we just say, we're a bunch of barbarians, or just because we don't understand them, we are pretending that we are better and that we have accomplished who knows what from a moral point of view. You really didn't, right? Because all what we should learn about the world is exactly to know the world better. And looking at what those people said to us in a moment in which they were dramatically more morally pressured than us is something that you cannot factually understand if you are in such a spoiled, comforting, and unearned position, from which you've just described with your modern scientific knowledge, what we know about the brain, which is dramatically few, right? And pursuing the delusion that science can solve any kind of problem, including why we exist, given that science is based as a mathematical language on purely conventional, approximate, and undemonstrated ideas, such as, think about in geometry, the point, the line, and the surface, that, fundamentally do not exist. And so it's not that by keeping to explain how the brain works, even assuming that we will ever have any technology that will show us the actual mechanisms, which I doubt, that we will find meaning per se, right? This is the delusion that they're actually telling you. Harris, I remember there was an interview with Shapiro that said, what Shapiro cornered him at some point. It was an interesting debate, because also Harris cornered him at some point. Shapiro asked him, therefore, what's morality about? What the idea of morality of these people is fundamentally finding out, like it's basically what Bacon believed in the 16th century, that is to make just a list of all the things that make you harm from a biological point of view, and hoping to have a manual basically that explains you how to cope with reality. I mean, can this be this is an asinine, childish idea that has been surpassed already by hundreds of years, if not actually millennia, because things also went back and forth a little bit, by philosophy, which is, but obviously, of course, but even von Clausewitz explains that brilliantly. You can't have a manual that tells you everything to do. It's useless. You would die before even sorting everything out. It doesn't serve to any practical purpose whatsoever. This has nothing to do with stopping science. This is just understanding actually how to use science in the best way, discovering ever more, but not pretending that you just are dependent on some sort of, tables that looks actually suspiciously closer to the terror of what these atheists like Harris do, in terms of being scared by religion because somebody in the past used it by enforcing a doctrine. So what would you actually enforce if you discovered all those things that you pretend to do scientifically, and telling you this is the absolute truth, right? Even if you had it, which you can't, because we're physically limited in a way that will never allow you to achieve even an infinitely minimal part of that this thing should be enforced according to you in the same way you think religions would do. The only difference, the difference here is that we have philosophical systems that are actually also scientific ones, right? There is all a branch of science. This is just for radical leftists in countries where have been dominated by Marxist ideology in academies that do not know that in normal countries there are scientists and theologians that work together, right? Theists and atheists that actually made beautiful books describing, for example, how the Genesis has an enormous and striking amount of correspondences to the actual understanding of the physical world, and how mankind, this is the crucial point, and that's where the spirituality, the morality, and the meaning comes from. The humanity puts itself in relation to. That is an actual statement of what is reality, right? What is the existential condition? What are our limits, and why this cannot be? What do you think? Why do you think that the idea of God is reconcilable with the one of science? Do you think there is a God out there that you can track physically? God is the cause of all things in the sense of the logos, as it was properly defined, in a way that by the same realization that we don't know what it is cannot be known, because it's the purpose of it all, that you have to find out yourself through science itself. It has nothing to do with searching somebody in the clouds. And it's actually I'm also pretty critical towards this cultural abomination. Of course, believers or alleged believers, because I frankly don't believe any person in the world was actually a believer, right? And this has nothing to do with the fact that you can, in a sense, believe, but you are always faulty, and that's also what the whole original sin is consistently about. And so there is a deeper metaphorical meaning even in the concept of fate, of belief. There are, by the way, two different things. Fate existed also in the same Indo-European mythology, and in connection to a soul divinity, right? This other incredible ignorance of people like Harris that go out there as if as scientists and claim things such as Christianity or Islam or Judaism were the first religions that claimed, for example, that there was a absolute truth that could not be contested on the base, for example, of a dictum or a written thing. But do you realize that, if you go to a historian of religion, it will spit you in the face. Pagans believed in the truth themselves. They were also intolerant, and rightfully so, because every civilization should be tolerant and intolerant at the same time. By some degree, it has to be balanced out. Why do we give credit to alleged scientists who do not even know the ABC of the history of religion from a completely secular point of view? Why is Harris somebody worth listening to? Well, he's just a guy who describes you how the brain works and literally doesn't know the ABC of something like historical religion. Why, this represents the most radically inferior educational background from which our alleged intelligentsia stems from. These people are radically uneducated for not just a 21st century context, but for what could be a 20th and 19th century context. 19th century context, culturally speaking, would destroy basically everything that we have today. People studied things for real at the time, were enormously cultured. They had an enormous understanding of the world. They had simply reached already to some tops that today, on average, our intelligentsia doesn't even know that they exist. And they are all written there. This is not an exoteric, sapiential, gem hidden somewhere in some dusty shelf. This is literally the pillars of our, science founders, what they wrote and what they came from, right? And this happens all the time, that we are distancing so much from the origins that we don't even realize that some things that we're thinking today have been already written, but not even 2,000 years ago. We're talking about 200 years ago, something that you can access if you just had a culture worth of this name. Why? And this gives you the scale of the complete and most total comprehensive ignorance in any field that we are claiming to know anything. And then you wonder why the world sucks and it goes badly, and people do not have faith anymore. They can't understand anything. They feel lost. They are introverted. They begin to feel resentful and violent, etc. Peterson doesn't talk about this, and that's where my criticism stems from. Because if there was an actual historical perspective from his side, there would be the complete mind-blowing realization that this is not an individual path, that this channel, Pursuit of Meaning, that shows Peterson that they are actually altering his content here just for the sake of clickbaiting. But you find the guy crying here in the thumbnail, I'm not an atheist anymore, because of all the thing of, I think I believe in God. Peterson was actually quite decent and in understanding. Of course, you don't go out there and say, I believe in God, right? Because it's too easy, too weak, it's false. It actually makes you look just like the cock of the situation, and really you're just faulty as you can be. And if you actually believe in God in the sense that you try to, you actually know that you can't, and that's what it actually means in a way to be on that train. And people mistake this anytime. This channel, for example, is just saying, I'm not an atheist. Atheist is underlined in a different color anymore. Why? Because the way this content is served is not really oriented to a real pursuit of meaning, as the title of this channel actually means. But it's a politically weaponized content. It's just saying, look, atheists are a bunch of idiots, which, considering, yes, every human group is a bunch of idiots, and of course the majority of atheists, as the majority of theists, as a matter of fact, are a bunch of idiots. And so it actually depletes and dilutes and vilifies even the content of a thinker like Peterson, that instead sees things much more deeply and is firstly intelligent and doesn't actually say what he's saying. I'll read you some other titles, and here the faces of Peterson also they inserted for the sake of searching for these deeper things. My final warning: this needs to stop. Right? These are the kind of contents that they put the biggest threat to our society. We must fight. What is this big threat? This is not. This is the point of the thing. The biggest threat to our society we must fight would be understood plainly by people only if there was this historical realization. If you just say to somebody who is habituated to be a lazy ass, to do nothing all day long, not to have values, not to have education, not to have any interest whatsoever, and just saying there and feeling, this guy on the internet is talking about me, now I can feel better about myself, is just basically telling them, look, you have to, get your act together, tidy up your room and go out there. If a person comes from that background, is simply incapable of doing that. Right? It's not because somebody tells him, just do it and everything will work fine. Then you will find the next generation of people who really made it, were successful millionaires with the most, the hottest chick ever at their side, happily married with lots of children, all this thing. It will not work. It will not work. There is not the fuel for that. There's not the fuel for that. Then you find some guy every once in a while said, I was like a homeless. I began tidying up my shelter. Then I'm a successful millionaire. And everybody says, oh, wow, great, man. You're so great. And then I would like to see all the people who like this comment, what kind of, that their financial situation is like, or what kind of their cultural background is, or what kind of position they are in their life, and what they are actually doing to improve that. Things will not change for this reason, and that's why they are actually using Peterson's ideas, in my opinion, to push still some of the lowest instinctual elements of the fourth estate, vile masses that we unlocked with the Industrial Revolution and the democratic revolutions and so on, that would have been a good thing by itself, but without moral background, because they were just down to obey at that point. So it's not that the past was the perfect world, not even. As people get me wrong all the time in this sense, but these people basically diluted all the value and brought in from the left side shit like communism and socialism, etc. On the right side, fascism and Nazism, internationalism, racism, and whatever. Very often they overlap in many ways, because you don't think that there are not socialists are not racist or nationalists or whatever. It's just that this content is just designed to cause a backlash among the most inferior strata of the population, just from the right side, just because nobody has ever done it up to this point, and just because the left did better up to this point in that field. And this is a horizontal divide. There is no vertical divide. There is no effort to tell these people, look, you will not achieve what you hope to achieve. Of course, if you're not motivated, if you have not also some support of whatever, in this sense also a minimal, you see, this is what also religion told to us, right? There can't be just the right or just the left. There must be a right and a left, right? There can't be just, you must want to do that and you will do it. You also need some material support for that. I believe that, of course, the ideal part is more important, right? If you have no motivation, as the opulence of our society shows from the material side, you go nowhere, right? Matter won't do it alone. So it's obviously the spirit is more important, and that's why I lean more from the right and conservative side, because to me that's the actual pool where I want to be at this point in history, because that's really what it's lacking, and we must counterbalance what's on the other side. But at the same time, we're not telling people actually to do anything really to better themselves. We're not teaching them anything. Like, Peterson is not really telling you, like, pick this book and study this thing because this thing will explain you this and that, and so you can achieve that goal better because you know that. No, it doesn't tell you that. For anybody who has studied, in general, and also when you look at history of technology, of science, of civilization, and then when you also are in tertiary education, you know perfectly well, if you look at economics, if you look at politics, that it just doesn't take to want something. You have to spit blood. You have to work with an enormous structural amount of resources to make things work, and it's not a guarantee of success. right? The guy that is watching this video and putting like, etc., is just, galvanizing himself temporarily, and just is what he's actually remaining to do every single day is remaining in his room, clicking on other videos, and, getting fatter and older and really not accomplishing anything. It's not going to happen by itself. Great part of this, in my opinion, is due to, of course, there is a lot of misery, of imagination, of actual issues, right, that are not just a leftistic invention. They are real, right? You cannot exclude the socio-economical factor from this. It's a big deal, right? But of course, there is a lack, properly, of spirituality, a lack of properly understanding of the world, right? If you, again, have never studied kind of history or politics or even this other spiritual, you cannot really, it could be history of religions, but I could tell you it could be even engineering. I'm not necessarily just saying it's about the humanistic dimension, right? I'm just saying it's more about that because in spite of how, and this is the unfortunate thing, especially in America and in other also kind of Americanized countries, that those humanistic fields are monopolized by the left, right? So the trick there is that all the people that actually do not have that type of education, and even when they go there, they remain disgusted by it, are just being rejected from, prevented properly from learning anything of that. And that's the Marxist project, by the way. That's exactly what they did in the Soviet Union, in Maoist China. It was the first purpose of the entire regime, eliminating any kind of cultural knowledge of any possible kind, and completely annihilating from a moral point of view the individual that could just be weaponized to become a slave in the machinery, right? And much, also what happens in the West is about this, not just because there's been a materialistic influx from Marxism, but of course because also, it doesn't just take to be, Westerner to be good. You have always to work, and there is a lot of exploitation, there's a lot of margination, and what is, of course, coming from the right, in fact, as a backlash against, you can see it here in Ukraine, it's not much the idea, let's understand the world, let's have a thorough, let's make a thorough research about the deeper international, political, strategic implications of what is going on. Not just, I don't want to pay gas more, right? And I shouldn't. This is keeping your world small. This is very close to what a Soviet would think like, right? And the reason why you think you're from the good side, because you're allegedly, again, right-wing or conservative, whatever, and you're actually harboring your, racistic resentment without saying out in public, because of course you don't even have the guts to go out there saying what you think, because of course you don't attribute any value to your own beliefs, even if they are wrong, proves that you are still part of the scum that is pressuring you from the other side. You're equal, right? This is not about right and left. This is about up and down. This is about the above and the underworld, literally. And you belong to the underworld. You don't believe. You don't belong to the elected. You don't, because you don't believe, really. Right, so it's not just signing for Peterson without even understanding what he says that will make you a better person. You will not learn how to tidy up your room. You will not be a more successful individual. You will not become a millionaire. You will not make it in life. And we're seeing it staunchly happening everywhere. Actually, this seems in fact to be more of a disease of the privileged than anyone else. And the reason, again, because these alleged privileged are privileged just maybe from a material point of view, but they're absolutely underdeveloped from a cultural, educational point of view. In other words, they don't know anything of what they're claiming to be Western values, tradition, or whatever, because simply they have never learned, never studied that. Do you have an idea of what Western culture is about? I mean, the entirety of the cultural legacy that you should be able to learn about from literally a historical, religious, literary, linguistically, folkloristic, anthropological point of view. I mean, do you even have a satisfactory knowledge? Of course you don't, about the history of your own country. You don't. Nobody does. Nobody does in absolute terms, but especially mandatory education nowadays doesn't provide you with any of that. It's a sketchy story that you fundamentally don't understand. That it's been designed historically to make you pretend as if you kind of understood anything of that. And of course, you've never been acquainted to things like historiography, to scientific publishing. You don't know properly the scale of the stuff that is being published out there. What are the main historiographical issues and problems and questions? And this expands at any level, not just making history the center of it all, and properly understanding. Do you know what's the ultimate meaning, even just of Christianity? Have you ever studied the Bible, or even just read it? Be honest. Have you ever studied, the Hellenic literature, Latin literature, Middle Latin literature, the main national, I don't know, British, French, German, Italian, Spanish, even, you can extend it even to Russian. I'm not making a Russophobic stand here, just even though I'm overwhelmingly pro-Ukraine and supporting to it, even militarily. The literatures, cultures, do you know anything of those? Like in a serious sense, have you ever read some books? Have you ever studied anything about that? Do you know what they mean? Of course you don't, because the overwhelming amount of the time, no kid today even feels the need to do that. The overwhelming amount of people today have as their main problem not to feel pressured. And therefore they keep their world smaller and smaller and smaller. Their sole point is, why can't I be left alone? Because civilization feeds itself of pressuring you and triggering a reaction to you to elevate yourself to be a better person that you are. That's why Peterson says you must suffer in order to achieve something. To many people, it's just like an emotionalistic message says, he's talking about when your mother dies, or when things go wrong, you don't have enough money to pay the rent. Yeah, it's also about that. That's pretty shitty stuff, and it happens to everybody, sadly enough. And there is much worse than that. It can happen for that matter, and that's very important. And I know that most people, to most people, that's more appealing than what I'm saying. That is to say that they should break their back additionally to learn things that they don't see any purpose of. But really, if you want to find any meaning, the same meaning that Peterson is talking about, or even actually more than that, there is no way but that one. Because the chances that you will manage to understand these things, even just by the sheer complexity of the intellectual point that they make and the amount of information that is required to frame them, the competence, the precisions, the tools, etc., cannot be created on your own by a normal life experience. It doesn't. You have really to build them up with that intensive studying that has to last basically your entire life. And it's obvious that most people can't do that. But that's also what I'm saying specifically, that Peterson does not address these questions. It does not address them because, of course, that would sound contemptuous, like my own speech. Like I sound like an asshole probably because, I'm telling you, everybody's scum. I even put myself in that. Like, you're never as good as you can be. And that should be your first focus. Just as your first focus for understanding God is not just a strange contractualistic delusion that if you pray God, you will or win the lottery or something like that, or you will be spared from suffering. The point of God is realizing that there is a point in our existence that there is always hope for things to go better, and that there is always a point in things we can do, because things will ultimately go wrong. So we should move the hell up to do things well, so that we'll have afforded something at the end of our lives that we can hopefully think that will have had a positive impact for whatever this incredible, unexplainable, and absolutely scientifically undemonstrable or explainable, in fact, reality of existence is, for not talking about of creation, the universe, or whatever. You should, of course, find meaning by yourself, but this is truly the challenge. And many people say, I should find a meaning by myself, by doing what? Spending my time posting some stuff on Instagram with quotes from the gospel that I have not even read or understood for that matter, and thinking that I'm a moral person so that other people can say, oh, look at the guy, it's so edgy because it's Christian. That's just a shitty life. It doesn't show any sign of improvement. So the other reason why actually Peterson doesn't address these ideas, of course, again, he is definitely more compromising than me. He knows that what he's doing, and I believe it too, is that, of course, already what he has done in his life is truly astonishing. Just like a human being, what he put himself at the service of is being amazing. So I can't criticize him. He did surely much more than me, and that I will probably be able to achieve. But at the same time, I do think, qualitatively speaking, there is more than can be done. That there is an even colder, harsher meaning that you can find that can really motivate you in a dramatically more powerful way, right? For example, I'm reading you this other thing of pursuit of meaning, that again, this stuff is basically taken from his videos and compacted in these other videos that they show here, that they display here for making the big money on YouTube. And says, Jordan Peterson stunning, which is in capital letters, ideas on science versus religion debate, right? And for example, this is yet another issue that I haven't really found explained very much, that is to say, Peterson is aware of the fact that science and religion collimate, right? That it's obvious, right? But still, this channel is feeding here in the thumbnail, there is science will not win over religion, right? As if, you see how the idiot who posted this, right, doesn't care about the principle, the scientific. It's just here for making a political point that he ultimately does not understand. Also, this other stuff, for example, I could criticize Peterson for some things. I think he has also bought a little bit, however, into the wrong conservative agenda, right? Because again, within conservatism, there's the good and the bad, right? And I think that again, Peterson has. I think this has happened with me too. The more I've learned things, especially about history, the more conservative I have become, but radically. And I can be very conservative in ways that I don't usually, I really talk about, but I don't tell you to which point I can be, but not conservative again in the strict, regulated idea. That is, I'm conservative just because, I don't know, I go to church every day. There's nothing to do with that. Something that can sound very brutal, but that has to do with the same proper pursuit of meaning. He's been citing, for example, I agree, I don't like what is going on in the US, in Canada, with the restrictions, with COVID, the protests, or the fact, but, if you put yourself, like, there was a video he made, for example, to the truckers that stopped working because of these restrictions they put on it for vaccine mandate and so on. I know that that's a big deal. I know that's important. I'm even okay that Peterson supports this stuff. The problem is that the way this is done, not even necessarily by him, nor even necessarily, I'm not against the truckers or what they're doing per se. Fundamentally, I don't care. I think that there is a meaning that goes so far beyond the stuff that you cannot put yourself at the service just of this specific political debate. Vaccine mandate is a big issue. It's definitely, I'm not sympathetic to what's being done, at least by a certain margin, a great margin of how the thing is being handled. But at the same time, here we're facing a civilizational collapse that is bigger than anything that you can imagine. Peterson has been vocal about this sometimes, but it's just in a couple of videos. It says, this is the biggest problem we have, to hurry, etc. But is he actually vocal all the time about that? No. He is, even if you click on this videos, I tried to do it on a couple of ones here. My final warning: this needs to stop. You think, you click in the video and you find Peterson actually talking about that? No, this is again a guy that made the montage of this. We decide to title the video in this way, and the video doesn't talk at all about that. Peterson is not talking about that specifically. Saying, this is clickbaiting, right? But again, the message that people get from this still is that, is the one of the clickbaiter, let's say, and not the one that Peterson is actually doing. Like, this is what you should be doing in 2022. Or this thing, this is a pathetic lie and you might believe it, right? Even just the language. You don't need this language. Like, this is a language like this. This is a weak language, right? You don't need to say that something is just pathetic per se, just to, intrigue people that there is this word of patheticism. Sometimes I insult Marxism and things. I saying, this is bullshit and all this stuff, but I mean it in the sense because I don't have the time to explain that. I could even make a video 4 hours long to explain that. That would be even too few for all the stuff that should be debunked. But this is not the point. This is point. I don't lure you into traps, into clickbaits, to say things eventually that have nothing to do with what I'm calling you here for. I thought about the darkest things for 30 years. What do you think he's talking about? Jordan Peterson gets emotional. It will give you goosebumps. Listen carefully. Then you click on this stuff, and maybe the guy is just talking about, I studied, the Holocaust, or, the gulags and all this stuff, and I understood that humanity, can make it even in the toughest of times. There is a danger, because that's really the message. It's not really about this dramatic thing that because there are even the pictures of the guy with different faces that should... I need to stop before it's too late. What do you think he's talking about? He's not really saying that we're a step away from total civilizational collapse, as I would basically tell you in a sense, even though I don't really mean that in absolute terms. But I still think that there is a really big deal, and I would tell you that. The reason, again, why Peterson doesn't push this to the extreme is, in my opinion, because it's as if, from his standpoint, he had studied this thing from clinical psychology with a bit of neuropsychology, evolutionary biology, all this stuff, and he, through his own way, through his own specialty, like I could have done from mine, found out that, of course, there is meaning. The more you know, the more you learn, the more you're educated, and that's also a reason why it's so easy today to buy into leftism, because people don't know anything anymore. So they're completely, without any moral or cultural resistance. It shows you that, of course, what is obvious of all this work is meant to maintain a hierarchy, to maintain an authority, to maintain an order, to maintain a discipline, and still some, of course, room for autonomy and debate and criticism, and even resistance at the same time, opposition, etc. But that's how the thing works. It works among humans. It works among animals. It's normal, right? And this is what Peterson found out. Okay. The other reason, however, why he doesn't push the thing to the extremes, again, is I think he hasn't envisaged the extremes yet. And this thing instead gets much darker from my side, because when I've studied this stuff, especially about the Indo-European religion, I realized that that is the traditional cultural voice, essentially what we have studied with von Clausewitz. That is to say that there should be a vision of the extreme, of the absolute. Peterson gets there. As we've seen in would dare say that they believe in God and all this stuff, but doesn't substantiate it literally from a behavioral point of view. He just shows you a certain pattern for which he tells you, look, if you follow these steps, you will become more socially functional. You will know how to speak up to your crush. You will be more or less agreeable depending on from which side you exceed. It will be you will be able to have a thorough communication. If you were too shy, things that are pathetic, by the way, because people who have these problems are, of course, he comes from clinical psychological experience, so he met with a lot of people that were not really particularly balanced in that sense. And so it's understandable also that he wants to help them, and I think it's very noble. If it's part of his job, his ethics, I have nothing to do with that. But we also have to think about this from an extra individual, from a collective point of view. And that's where, again, in my opinion, the historical element has not been taken in consideration. Now, what actually is pretty disturbing for most audience, I presume, at least from the liberal standards that exist in popular culture, is especially the role of men and women. I haven't been vocal about this more than much. Basically, the video on taming the female deity of victory, demon of victory, is the only one that where I addressed the question, but I've told about that, when we have seen Roman religion, the rape of the Sabines, all these things. That is, in my opinion, crucial in a way that Peterson has understood, but not to the utmost extreme. Right, for a guy, as we were saying at the beginning of the video, that compromises even with feminism at some point, because as a liberal guy, let's be honest about it, raised in the West, in very well developed Canada and so on, the idea is that, feminism, after all, yes, let's give them something to, let's give something to it, yes, after all, they got women to vote, yeah, we can cheer that. Well, again, this has nothing to do with feminism. This has to do just with the fact that we realized, of course, that at that point we needed women and their enormous experience and sensitivity and intelligence, etc., to make civilization work. It had arrived right to that point. The only problem, as we were saying before, is that in the process we have not maintained an order in the realm of ideas. We have let women not fighting just for voting rights, for emancipation, for being more autonomous, for pursuing their goals, etc. We have let the poison spread in the direction of whatever existed before was pure evil. Everything must be destroyed. Men are just pigs. They're violent. They just want to rape us. We should, I don't know what, by the way, it's not even a female standpoint at that point. That's a broader Marxistic criticism to Western civilization and all its cultural values, right? So any form of feminism, as by definition, as any form of masculinism is sexist by definition, that is meaning feminist, is a form of sexism. Linguistically, etymologically, it's the same thing, right? So you can never condone that by any stretch of the imagination. There is no ground for it. As I was saying before, you can't find, even in Nazism or fascism or communism, some achievement, right? There were, some archaeological finds, some, technological feats. That was a very positive thing, but still the thing happened within a terroristic, demonic situation where people were, exterminated en masse and, terrorized and, how these things ended. So it's not that at that point we are praising, if, Soviet or, I don't know, Italian fascist archaeologists discovered something cool, or the Nazi engineers made dramatic steps forwards in rocket science, all this stuff that, we are praising National Socialism or fascism or communism in the process, right? Those were just human beings using science, reason to achieve pretty good damn stuff, right? Then, morally speaking, they were fucked up and they would use that to enormous detriment of the same civilization. Now, feminism is exactly the same thing. As Peterson says, it acquired as an expression, we must separate the wheat from the chaff. So again, you don't need to compromise with this bullshit like feminism to realize that it's empty. You see what's the point in these ideologies, that they're not much ideologies per se. Right? What thinkers as Peterson and others have highlighted is that there is no science to the whole thing. That it's more like an emptiness than anything. It's like a black hole of delusion, delirium. There is no real science to any of this. When you study what tradition was about, again, as we were saying before, people were ignorant in the past. We had much less scientific evidence, so I don't know, we believed in bullshit like that women were stupid because they had shoulders that were on average smaller, and so Aristotle had said that, there was not enough blood were arrived in their brains, and so they were more stupid. Like literally, this was, the officially Aristotelic proof of the fact that women were somewhat inferior beings. And for millennia, people believed this bullshit, right? Aristotle, that I enormously estimate in his historical context, philosophically, scientifically. I'm a rationalist, so I love all Aristotle, Aquinas, Descartes, Kant, etc. So they are my heroes. But of course, that's a good example from Aristotle of how, science sucked in his times. And no human society has ever been perfect. This is also evident, right? No human community has ever been perfect. Their beliefs were faulty. At the same time, however, what was the moral understanding of the relation between man and woman? Right? How do we motivate? I should make another video for this. The fact that women, throughout all our civilization, were fundamentally subjugated by men, right? Or at least they were properly put in a condition of, of inferiority, right? They were under. There's no doubt about that. There are, unfortunately, today many crazes will go out there, first of all, saying this was not true, this was just Western civilization. That's leftist bullshit, has no value whatsoever. Basically, nearly the complete entirety of all human communities, cultures, history were patriarchal, right? And this has nothing to do with race. So those people who say, "Oh, why it's so terrible?" They were just misogynistic, and look at what they were doing in Black Africa, look at what we're doing in China, look at what we're doing among Native Americans, and then tell me, who is actually who that improved female living conditions and quality of life first, and also throughout the same modernization we talk about in the first place. It's not a racial divide. It's simply, different peoples do different things. If there are boundaries and they develop at different stages, it's completely normal, right? Secondly, for example, picking the Indo-European ideology, there is actually no real, violence against women is never condoned, for example. It's never condoned in the sense that it showed existing, but it showed existing for the wrong reasons. When I talk about Indo-European religion, by the way, I'm actually talking about the entirety of Indo-European people's religions that we know of, that we have tracked: the Hellenic, the Roman, the Vedic, the Germanic. There's essentially ones, because for the Celts, the Slavs, we have less, but still. And of course, other peoples had the same beliefs. So when we realized that, of course, there were archetypal roots, even in language, there is this falsehood that's being spread, even just, I think, by Marxist historiography, that there was never like a kind of an Indo-European people. This is just about debating about whether the glass is half full or half empty. It's actually there were Indo-European peoples. The matrix language did exist, and that's in fact exactly the same language from which our European language departed from, and we still basically speak the same languages, especially from a phonetic point of view. That these were, phonemes were connected to certain celestial movements that the Semitic peoples believed were happening in the skies, and so language was sacred together with lots of other things. I don't know where these people have where they have not studied this stuff. In any case, there's an enormous oceanic historiography on this stuff from the most updated nature, so it's no invention and conspiracy theory. It's just pure and open plain historiography, as the one is taught everywhere. That is not like in all the West, as far as I'm concerned. There are places that are being taken over by Marxism at the point that these things cannot be taught. Well, it's a completely different problem. It has nothing to do with science. It's just the destruction of it, nothing else. Pure blind iconoclasm and fear and ignorance and misery. And however, this Indo-European mythology was focused on the idea, of course, that was a dichotomy between men and women. I will make videos on this specifically. That corresponded, as we were saying before, male to order, discipline, clarity, rationality, the light, the celestial, gods of victory, of glory, etc., that had to dominate on women. Intended, these are archetypes. Like, they're not meant from a strictly biological point of view, but they were, of course, mirroring them. That is instead, in fact, the Dionysian, more hubris, emotionalistic, more sentimentally fatalistic dominated, agrarian, hence fertility, connected, tonic, telluric dimension over which the Indo-Europeans represented this virility came to rule over. And of course, the dichotomy means that the Indo-European men as warriors came to these agricultural places in Europe, sedentary populations, killed the men as was their habit in the war, and took the women and ingravitated them for bringing the next generation of heroes and all this stuff. This is normal cycles in every kind of tribal military reality in every continent in the world. And it's present, in fact, everywhere. Native America, I will make a video about this. It was everywhere the same thing. We all passed through this. This heavily informed, of course, our idea of what properly the world is about, and is, of course, connected to some evident biological divides, right? In worlds like those where literally there was no space for any kind of surplus of any kind. Either you did what served to survive or you died, fundamentally. Of course, men, as they were biologically structured already by evolution, were just the most fit for hunting, fighting, clashing, that they looking far away, orientating themselves, covering large spaces, all these things. Women instead were the more sedentary, calm, placid, but also kind of more sensitive, emotional, kind of more, in fact, tonic elements of society who had to take care of the children, understanding their emotions, collecting food, in a, in fact, agrarian fashion, and recognizing the plants, and keeping their world kind of more contained to the smaller dimension, spatially speaking, but knowing better some difference. It's the same, banally speaking, why as men we can read maps, geographical maps. At least we were able to. I'm still proudly. I remember I worked as a navigator for my father in the car while we toured all Scotland. And I was 14, actually 13, and I never got wrong except once, but we got to see a beautiful bay. We can read maps, etc. You open the fridge or the closet, you can't find what is literally 1 millimeter in front of you, and you call your mother and say, Mom, where did you, put this? It's literally in front of your face, right? And you can't see that because women can't do that, men can't, right? And that's why women can't read maps, and they have to turn them, right, and all this stuff. Of course, lots of women can, but it's just not the average, because by average, scientifically, we have discovered that it's not the case, and men are just, on average, incapable finding stuff in the fridge or in the closet, including me, and I know that there are men who can. And it turns out, not only that, but it turns out that on average, men and women, in fact, have, in this sense, just different tendencies based on what, according to you, what makes men and women on a genetic level is, of course, also how their hormones work in their development as beings, and of course, this brings to choosing different subjects or activities, and so on, and that's on average perfectly normal. Right, women with more male hormones tend to go more towards things like engineering or stuff. Men with more, female hormones tend to go towards, literature, art, or things like that. We all have a male and feminine side, right? Peterson himself is, aware. He said that a feminine side. He gets emotional. Sometimes he cries. There's nothing wrong with that. He's a very, I would say, he's a good man. That who understands how that emotions are important, have to be let out sometimes in certain circumstances. He has his degree of femininity. Who cares, right? And this whole thing, in fact, is the entire base that justifies, not just an evolutionary biological point of view, but also from a cultural point of view, the difference between men and women. And the reason why this difference exists is not enforced, because first of all, it's evolutionary. Secondly, it's so way before we could create civilization, right? Secondly, civilization was built on it because evidently it served a purpose, even in terms of civilization, because on average, a woman is also much more physically weak than a man, on average. And the fact that you can train a woman to be, a boxer that kicks ass or whatever, and they can perfectly do that, still doesn't mean that on average she has to struggle more than a man to achieve that. Because men just are much better predisposed in that sense. So it's that easy, that obvious. The same reason why it's a crime to participate trans people in sports that do not pertain to them, and surprise, surprise, it's most of the times men. So alleged trans women who actually go into female sports to dominate them just because they're much bigger, and it's easy for them. At that point, any woman worth of this name should abandon that sport immediately in sign of protest. Also, any man worth of this name should support this in the same. I mean, should support this decision of bailing out in the same way. Instead, we are all clapping like a bunch of chimps to the next leftistic delusion that has nothing to do with any kind of biological evidence or moral dimension or anything. It's just a way to inflate, essentially, to let mentally ill people to keep pretending that they're doing well, and this doesn't seem to be changing actually good anything in terms of suicide rates or acceptance or whatever that is in culture that you cannot alterate because it was done by nature, not by the first moron who because of personal frustration and moral misery or lack of any kind of education feels the need to do this crap. And that's it. And that's what just basically in more urban terms Peterson is saying, like many other people, any sensible person that has a minimal intelligence, and that's why the enormous backlash against. If you actually study the degree by which sex is so well defined, what the actual models are in, Indo-European religion, and what these roles are, and how deep the understanding of the psychology of it all is, and how much also this, of course, perfectly overlaps with what Peterson says in terms of neuropsychology, of evolutionary biology, all the reasons why men and women are attracted to each other in the way they do, differently, in the dichotomy, is perfectly exemplified by those mythologies. That is, these primitive peoples, thousands of years ago, they didn't even have a written culture, but they believed already because they had understood how the thing worked. And they had understood it. This is the interesting thing. They had not understood it because, of some sapiential abstract speculation on how these roles should have supposedly been and enforced that, as, a Marxist would like to believe. But because they were functional to that community, that is, nobody actually ever decided these roles to exist. They existed. They pre-existed the same culture, pre-existed the same civilization. They were functional to that kind of living, to that kind of a world, to the way these peoples had to survive in a way or another. And it is true, this is true, and it's actually confirming the point that peoples like the Indo-Europeans ones, for example, were much more militaristic oriented, so patriarchal, virilely oriented. This has nothing to do with that, even with the fact that even the peoples that they conquered were. It's just they were less than them, not that the thing was reversed with women ruling, right? It's just that, and this is very important to stress because eventually these realities, especially in the times of the conquest that were, of course, predating most of documentation, were surviving in the mythology that we study, right? That is not literally the one that existed at the time. It was some degree of fabrication. The enemies were depicted like that. I mean, the stereotype that, of course, women were kind of more important in certain contexts in the balance of the community among the agricultural, Pelasgian, Chthonic, pre-Indo-European peoples that were eventually conquered by the Caucasian vanquishers, is expressed in a very clear dichotomy by the myths. That the myths that were not actually rationalizing that either. They weren't like saying, look, people from 2,000 years from now, like we are divided in this way. No, they were literally telling you in the story by presenting the characters and showing interacting. And that is really the sedimentation of an enormous deal of civilization and culture. That, of course, if the people that eventually were defeated could have spoken, probably would have said the story in a different way, and probably would have also evidenced the fact that women weren't that radically more relevant, at least more different in their own society than the ones of the Indo-Europeans, right? Because it was even an insult, right? Saying to a man, "You're a woman," right? And today apparently that's become something else, and that's how far we have forgotten properly the function that lays beyond that. And the reason why we have forgotten this, of course, is that the function for which those values existed is not present anymore. The question is it not present anymore in toto? Because if you said that, you would say, well, that's a point in favor of Marxists that after all say, that's just cultural. Well, no, as we've seen, it's actually a biological thing. It cannot be erased. The problem that is happening right now, in fact, it's not a problem of women taking over men. The problem is the complete emptiness and emptying properly as an activity, a purpose activity of both masculinity and femininity. Right? You can't say that the roles are being switched. It's that people are losing human worth individually. So if you're a man, you lose masculinity. If you're a woman, you lose femininity. And this is not happening in a sex switching direction. This is happening in the direction of asexuation, we could say, and that is weaker people. The reason why we're tricked into believing that this is not the case is that the media that are buying to the leftist propaganda are showing provocative images with which you see women that are ever more androgynous or men that are always more feminine, but in the sense that they are literally, like, that's what transgenderism is about, that they're literally conflating the two things, right? Not that they are less asexuated. What you actually instead find in reality, even just through demographics and you see natality rate, all this stuff, is that more than the switching of the roles, there is kind of a purification of the roles in the sense that people are becoming ever less asexuated. That is, people don't see properly the point of what making children is. That is to say, not a function that was culturally invented, but literally the function that nature has in every single damn being, that is to reproduce, and that evidently in humans that are no exception, as they would be the only one, by the way, has to do with some kind of mental problem. Right, so something artificial that has been inculcated in them in some ways that I actually don't think that is only, again, leftistic propaganda. This is what mostly conservatives believe, but it's not really the point, right? Because, again, those is actually the reflection just of the typical mass ignorant mentality that is just left or right. What's actually happening with leftism is just a consequence of a prior collapse that happened from a moral point of view, that occurred also in part because of the fact life was easier, and so we don't see the point, the purpose anymore, right? We don't feel engaged. We don't feel like what do we do this for? We have conceptualized to rationalized too much. We have which is not even bad, right? But we haven't learned in the same ways, and so in the same amounts of what we would need to understand the functionality of this purpose. Right, so the thing has collapsed. It's not because there were anti-conceptual means that now finally brought us back to a time where probably there wasn't like a family. Family could be a construct in a sense, but it's also, in fact, that's more floating in history, but not really at the point of saying because that's the sexes do not matter. There's absolutely nothing to do with that, right? It's nuclear families, etc., do derive from times where anti-conceptual means and for the spread of disease, etc., were not present, were not possible. At least it could not be achieved on the scale, etc. There is so the idea even in there of an alleged freedom of the woman obtained by this, that also Peterson has said it's the case. It's not a real freedom. Right, it's a freedom that actually brings to a to a disaster, because from one side it's ideological. Yes, if you use a condom, at that point you can't do is essentially the same thing without the consequence. But if you start taking, for example, anticonceptional pills, well, at that point you block you threaten a female fertility at that point. So that this is an issue, right? And many women start taking this stuff, and then they can't actually ovulate anymore at some point. And this is such a radical, properly disregard towards even the same bodily functions and reality, that you say, why did you even do that, right? And so many other things that you can see here going on with properly the lack of realization that then body and flesh are one, that you cannot really separate them, that your genetic structure has nothing to do with what you clothe yourself with, or with whatever surgical stuff you carry out. You are a man, you're a woman, and that's why the whole gender theory is just completely bullshit, because you cannot clothe something hoping to make it seem a way that it's actually not. And who cares that you're referring to gender, not to sex? Right, gender is just existing function of sex, right? And so to pretend that there's nothing to do with that, it's just pure lunacy. It's just a nominalistic heresy, and not more than just essentially a self-delusion and disappointment. And the same goes just, if weren't enough in terms of individual satisfaction, that is to say, can a woman or a man feel accomplished if they don't have children in their lives? Of course, it's not a huge tragedy, like if you can't have children, okay, you shouldn't kill yourself for that, but if you can, and you waste a chance, and you're also properly, your entire existential purpose is actually coming less. You can argue that we have culturally developed certain models that may not apply to how the world is changing, but this has nothing to do with the fact that being a man and a woman is connected to properly the biology of it is. And so you cannot pretend, as how much for how hard you try, that not having succeeded in that sense doesn't have a meaning that goes beyond culture, is actually rooted in your genes. But this is a completely different tangent that I'm taking here, but this is just for saying that what the older traditions were looking at was of course at a necessity that was in part even artificial. It was dictated by mindset. It was about being a more successful, crafty community that could expand, prosper, and defend itself. But it was the roles that the different humans had were of course sex-based, and it couldn't be otherwise, right? And again, we're talking about average, and I think we know what we're talking about. Don't come up to me, I'm a military historian, I know that there were women that were fighting, but this has nothing to do with the fact that, that this was just definitely not the normality and the average, and it was just, an exception in many instances. And also, why shouldn't a woman be able to fight in some circumstances, right? But it's a bit different from considering them in a structurally, normally and parified fashioned with the typical male warrior, even though there were actually female warriors in some cases, but there were still exceptions and reminded as such, right? This is just a shout out for those ethno-nationalists who want to creep into the more, the leftist, political acceptability by thinking that there were some peoples in the past that were allegedly more democratic, like in the Iron Age, because they found maybe a woman that was, buried with an axe together with them. There's absolutely nothing to that. Very often that there is only racial supremacism behind these ideas. It's nothing to do with historical reality. That sometimes, people can't even distinguish from mythology that is archetypal, and that of course has a meaning and an adherence to reality, but in the meanings. And we'll talk about that, because there is a lot about knighthood and female figures in those contexts that are to be intended archetypically and not really as literal things. We've seen it with the female demon of victory, that female demon of victory that must be tamed by the warrior to become a hero and to transform the spirit into the celestial glory that will bring him in heaven is female because it's the chthonic Dionysian element that lives within our soul and body that must be evoked and tamed in order to perfect ourselves. That is exactly what Peterson is doing when he's talking about the need of suffering and struggling with your own inner demon. When you are, if you want to become a better person and to obtain the ultimate meaning. Has Peterson ever talked about this stuff? Probably he has never read about it, right? And if he did, he came up with by quoting Indo-European mythology. Probably he would be deemed to be a neo-Nazi or something, because just Indo-Europeans. But as a matter of fact, this is documented also in other cultures. And it's just the Indo-Europeans are the best documented, because fortunately we had traditions and cultures that at some point of the different stage of developments of Europeans that kind of described each other in ways that, with a documentary, some of them were already literate and they could write about that, or they could remember of their own tradition. So if the reason why Peterson will not tell you this is that, of course, he's not a historian. Of course, he's not a historian of religion. Of course, he hasn't... I didn't talk about von Clausewitz. He's not a polemologist. He's not... Because von Clausewitz actually tells, in a way, the same things when he talks about how to achieve victory, and in the struggle of it, there is never a guarantee of pure victory, which is toying there with the concept of absolute war and what this means. And even there is an archetype that is often mixed, often equivocated. It's not a surprise that Nazis equivocated the Clausewitzian principle by misinterpreting absolute war into total war and convincing the masses, the chthonic masses, into joining to the resistance to death by the end of World War II, when they had already lost, in 1943. So equally, many people will see Peterson as many of the chthonic. We think of them as conservatives. You shouldn't, because it's an insult to conservatism, to true conservatism. What we see is that there are masses of these chthonic fourth staters who would listen to Peterson and will not see any of this, would just think that Peterson is an easy trick manual guide of the same kind that developed in the second half of the 20th century, just in the moment in which the masses were enough literate to at least be more vocal about their delusions and metropolitan legions, that think that if you follow Jordan Peterson, man, you will change your life, you will succeed immediately from a moment to another. This is the myth, the bullshit. Right, and that's the same reason why people can't understand military history, because even if you told them about what von Clausewitz says, they would think that there is a formula for victory. And the moment in which they realize that actually von Clausewitz is not saying that, then what the hell do we use it for? Let's go to Sun Tzu, because that at least he claims that you can always win if you do what he says, and of course you won't, because Sun Tzu is a dramatically more, say, underdeveloped system than what you can compare to the Clausewitzian one in the first place. It has nothing to do properly with the purpose that even von Clausewitz as a much more complete and extensive thinker, and with enormous, much greater scientific understanding, what was actually saying and explaining uselessly to you, right? So Peterson for many has become the easy shortcut for failed people to feel as if they had any hope without doing anything. It's become also, a scarecrow used at least as such by the leftists to say, this is the terrible patriarchy defender, and okay, leftists equally undereducated. And what I wouldn't like is him, in fact, to pass down to history essentially as this, because what actually the media have made of him in a way or another is this, right? The entire point of, let's say, people who invite him is not explaining them scientifically if he has a comprehensive theory or system and making them understand. The only thing they ask him is why they hate you, right? If they are conservatives, is why those terrible leftists, they hate you. If they're leftists, because you're a freaking neo-Nazi or whatever. And so since we are dominated by the fourth state, so some of you ask me what the fourth state is, what the three estates are. There was the nobility, the clergy, and then the bourgeoisie. Then the fourth state would be the proletarians, but in a more contemporary sense, it's basically the radically underdeveloped masses that pretend to have any degree of, of capacity or competence or education whatsoever, and that still instead, don't accomplish anything in their lives. So exactly what's become, in a sense, the target, of course, of Peterson's ideas, inadvertently. It is true that, of course, there is some horizontal tension as well, because, of course, feminism, Marxism have emasculated men, and so these people feel angry and aggressive. But again, they don't realize that it's not just, that, yes, finally somebody like Peterson says, you're a man and it's fine, like you're a white person and it's fine, like somebody else wouldn't like it to be. But this is something, first of all, you should have known already by yourself. Like, if you were brought down by those ideas, it's just because it can be harsh to meet that kind of discrimination, there is no doubt. But again, if you're so specially loaded in tradition and values, etc., and capacity, you should have simply withstood that. Instead, if the fact that you didn't already tells that there is something wrong in the entire system that doesn't depend on left and right. And speaking of of Peterson's legacy, in a sense, I think that you see, I have read, what do you have here of Peterson? I've read a very few stuff because I didn't like him, to tell you the truth, the way he writes, because I think I write much better. Now, I'm serious, meaning that the work he made is, he's a very intelligent person. He can write, surely, very complex things, right? So he wrote some disclosuring books that, of course, are not the way you would write in a scientific publishing, but yes, it was the 12 Rules for Life. I was curious. I got this book, but I didn't read it. I read just a bunch of stuff, and to tell it all, I should never judge a book from not having finished it in the first place. I would say this: I've read some page from here and there that. Considering also I knew what Peterson talked about, because I watched really many videos back in the day, I get the broader sense of it. I must say that this book, as probably all the others he wrote, is very simply written, right? There is it's very simply and easily written, meaning that he probably didn't make this a radical intellectual effort, right? He threw there some interesting information. It could be of some kind of scientific nature, but anecdotally, right? And then he builds up this 12 rules that are, somewhat debatable, because in my opinion, like, it's just like a list of things, is not really my systemic, comprehensive understanding of the world, right? They're always approximated, and they don't really tell you what you should do or literally what they mean, right? It was something like pet a stray cat if you find. I love cats personally, but I don't think that it should be one of my rules for life to pet a stray cat, even when I do. The point is, let's say, he says banal things. Let's be honest, and probably they were meant to be banal, right? Just toughen up. Like the language itself is very simple because it's directed to lots of different people. I understand that, right? It's a communication strategy. It's fine. I'm just saying that, it's unimpressive. Like, if you're searching for meaning and purpose in such books, of course, if you have never heard of these ideas and you are really despaired and you feel down, they can't help you, right? Peterson surely knows his deal when he's talking to psychologically striving people. So this is a very good book, but it's a book that I would advise to, I don't know, at best at 20 years old, right? And with no offense, frankly, because there are many youngsters who are even, way beyond this kind of reads. So my point is, again, this is, I don't know whether this was a commercial thing or not. I'm sure he was in good faith. He wrote this stuff. And again, I am a fan of the guy, so I really, it's fine what he did. I'm just saying that if you think to go there to actually get the meaning from a systemic or structural point of view about your life and understanding the whole thing, you won't get it. Because again, if you don't make the work to actually build something, through which you can understand the mechanism of the world, which is a big thing that many people really don't have time and resources to achieve, it's very difficult for you to find that degree of meaning. That is to say, of course, applicating to something, working, keeping, expressing your creativity, your craftiness, your entrepreneurship is very important. But this doesn't mean that an hurricane can't arrive metaphorically, also not metaphorically enough, as we can see here, often, unfortunately, sometimes. But I'm talking about properly the idea, a major tragedy can be a heartbreak, kind of a loss of some kind, can be economical problems, and still, because you won't make it. And Peterson, in this sense, skips a little bit the thing, because he's an optimist in some ways, right? He needs to, and I agree with him, that he wants to put out this positive message that is, you can do it if you put your get your act together, if you put a real effort in your work, and you go on every day, you can really achieve a lot. And he even says, I know people who followed my advice and became millionaires, or improved at least their living condition by far. And I understand that, because if you're already gifted in some ways, like not everybody's just person without possibilities, let's say. So we all come from some background that, even if we are fourth staters, I don't know if I'm a fourth stater, no, I'm objectively not, but I know that there are the majority is kind of people that I see everywhere that really don't have that horizon, right? Because either they can't, or they never cared, or they don't have the possibility of whatever. And Peterson said, well, okay, you can't fail. I'm not saying it's it will always succeed. It's hard, but he skips. He doesn't say that, of course, things can go ruinously wrong. They will go ruinously wrong more often than not. He stresses more than else, believe in yourself, work hard, and do it. It's good ethics, but the problem is still, can we have a broader understanding of why these things still happen? Because you, Peterson, may know that, right? Because you have a comprehensive understanding of some things that are really big in the world, and so you can space there. But the average person that believes you and then does these things and still fails may say, fuck this, right? Not necessarily because he may hate you because you didn't promise him anything or whatever, but let's say, as we were saying before, it's not necessarily going to be enough. In fact, this starting from the individual is important from one side, because it's only the individual that should make the difference. The entire ethics of responsibility that Peterson expresses is perfectly, I share it wholeheartedly. In fact, that's why it's possibly the thing I like him the most for. But if it is just, don't care about whom you are, that is, just think that a little bit of effort will make the magic by itself, just know that it's physically extremely unlikely, right? Things can improve, but they will not necessarily improve the way you hope they would improve, like. And to tell you otherwise is just a real lie, and a big one. And in order to understand why this is, you should go far beyond what your four walls or just your place of work actually is about. And I know, again, for most people it's really difficult, it's really impossible, but this doesn't just get down to pursue your dreams. Because there are many people who died pursuing their dreams because they really want to achieve them and make the utmost effort, but they didn't have the means anyway, morally and materially. A leftist would just tell you materially, because morality doesn't have to exist. It's all the damn patriarchy's fault, according to them. No, they failed because they failed, and this is the problem, the most radical problem of all. They failed morally. It's the example I was doing yesterday. Like, if you tell a person that, it's a great thing that if you achieve from 2, you achieve 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7, it increases. Wow! But what actually you need to succeed is 2,344, and you don't even know that, because you think success is somewhere along 16, 17, you're done for, right? And what I'm saying is that you should think big and a lot and working dramatically much more than you can think in that systemic meaning of meaning. Than most people are willing to do in the first place, right? Imagine that this was like a contract that Peterson had to sell, which he doesn't, or that I want to make you sell, right? If I tell you, yes, you can always make it, yes, and then we all know that we'll not make it because we kind of know much better than them because we've been there before, that, that will not be enough. Maybe you will help this person in a way. It will have been better than just the person remaining sitting ducks doing anything and dying slowly without doing anything, accomplish anything in the first place. But at the same time, we cannot lie to people at the point of saying, look, that because we know how much there is to do. And that's why I urge people to learn history, because until you don't learn history, you don't have a real dimension of that 2,344. You don't have the real dimension of what politics, war, or society is until you make the effort properly to imagine all that. So you can't just say a person, be a wood carver if you really feel like, and just don't think about anything else, just be a good wood carver. Because being a good wood carver quite likely will still not make you particularly successful in the endeavor for what you need as a human being to really elevate yourself at some points where you can't really claim to be satisfied, with all respect with wood carvers. And I even know wood carvers at some level, and in fact I can tell you some of them, not because they were wood carvers, but because just they were in situations that maybe could just left them to be wood carvers. Before that, really weren't that successful, and I was sorry for them. Was one even a girl that I liked, for that matter. She was even very talented, but still she lived miserably, and she was good, at it, but at the same time, that's not what the magic can be done. So there is obviously a much greater meaning that Peterson sees and presents, and that's why religion, hierarchy, moral values, family, love. Peterson does say all this. I'm not criticizing. I don't want to make you think that I'm saying, he's doing something he shouldn't do. I'm just saying that while stating this thing theoretically, he doesn't substantiate this with, for example, the historical evidence of that. He will just talk to you about lobsters, about which I presume he's right, but that do not have the same power, the motivational capacity that can have telling about the history of a civilization, of really studying and understanding history, literature, religion, anthropology, reading lots of stuff, not for killing the time. I know people who read a lifetime and they have no structure. This is the entire point, the hierarchy. It's not just, you see, this is the quality of it all, and also about the complexity of reality. You can read your entire life. I know people that have read their entire life, and if you talk to them, they don't really understand much about the world. Because for them, reading was just, learning the story and then passing to the next one without even thinking that too much. That's the difference, for example, between reading and understanding, or understanding and studying, right? And studying and teaching, for example. These are all things that change your mind dramatically according to which they are, so that you can simply read and not achieving anything of what is in between. And what is in between, again, is not just a mere sum of difficulties, like it's like passing from 1 to 2 to 3. It's like from passing from 1 to 3 to 9 to 27. And so what is actually comforting in this picture is that the moral misery in which we live, in terms of ignorance, of incompetence, lack of ambitions and capacity, actually is much more easily surpassable if we even accepted that we have to make that effort. The greatest difficulty in this sense is not being willing to make an effort, or not knowing how few after all it actually takes. In fact, with my speech, I don't want to dispirit people who say, "Oh, but I don't have a formal education, thus I'm just going to be a failure." No, it's not like that. But you have to understand that formal education may not be, for example, the problem solver, because education today is pretty bad in many ways, but still there is the good way of doing it, and you could understand what it is. And you should, however, go out there and get education in order to understand. If this is too difficult for you, or even if you can't afford that, that is a problem. You can improve your situation, but you should understand that without this structural means, it's very difficult to achieve. And you say, well, that you're making, a structuralist, maybe it's kind of leftist sounding as a point. Well, it's not really leftist sounding. It's simply realizing that, which are the people who live better in the world? The one in the third world or the one in the first world? And why? Right? It's just culture. It's not just culture. Culturalism is bullshit as well, right? It's even a racist idea. It's because resources, materially speaking, yes, are important. So you can't deny that. What we're saying, however, is that in today's world, and Peterson also agrees in this fundamentally, that the challenges that we're presented with are, let's say, from an individual point of view, like what we can't do individually, we can achieve much more than we think normally, just from the material standpoint that by default we already have. Like who complains for minimum wage and things like that to be needed in order to improve, that's a lazy excuse, right? It's not about minimum wage. Again, it's about motivation and purpose and meaning, of course. And so it's a bit of a snake who bites its tail, but not much when we understand that, again, if you study history, that your grandparents were maybe living in a world that was paradoxically less dangerous than today, in a sense, right? I don't know, if your grandparents lived before nuclear weapons, definitely they lived, in spite of things like World War II before nuclear weapons came about, in a safer world in terms of systemic stability. That is, you could die more easily of illness or whatever, but let's say the world at least were more stable. Today we're facing challenges that instead seem to be much more structurally dangerous. But from an individual point of view, what your grandparents did at the time was an enormous effort that you are not even trying to do now individually. So you can whine that there are greater challenges nowadays than ever. Yes, but what are you actually doing to solve anything if your only point is, I want to have a minimum wage? Right? There may be even a point to that in some theory aspect, but let's say if you were to wait, it's your life. Why don't you start kind of spitting blood if you really care? That's why you need the truth. That's what Peterson is saying. So I believe in the eternal struggle, of course, between Marx and Weber, that believed, respectively, it's the matter, no, it's the spirit. That, of course, the spirit is more important because the matter is just unanimated. The matter can screw up things pretty much, right? Starting from the world and resources, whatever, there's no doubt. But again, the only one who's going to change that or make the difference is the spirit. You're going to die anyway. There's not really any other way to make it. Right, so fortunately we live in realities that can still fix most problems if we really were at work. So we could talk for a long time about what Peterson is getting to. Like I could talk about dialectically, right? Peterson, as I was saying before, is very nice towards his guests because when he invites to talk with them to talk with him in his podcast, he's really open. He wants them to speak, right? And he is, demon. He's always, but what do you think about meaning? What do you think about meaning, right? There are all these people that are called, even sometimes from opposite fields that, like I was talking about Harris before, start talking about all this, whatever their field of expertise is to show off. And people just explain the mechanism of it. This is typical of hyper-specialization. And it mostly has to do with how academics, in fact, relate to him. If he invites another guy that maybe is just an average guy who went through something, particular, they are actually much better videos because they're much more human and comprehensive and based on experience, right? So when he talks with specialists instead, he always, gets to, what do you think? Do you think that this has a meaning? How does it fit? How does this knowledge fit with some universal applicability, and what you should do and not do, right? And he's always in search of meaning. But this meaning, in a way, I think he seems to be quite troubled by that, because if you follow his content, he's kind of as we were saying before, he's often an emotional person, right? Not because he loses control, but you can see his at least he feels for things that are being told. He really cares about finding that meaning in that struggle, right? And he sees that as the struggle. And I think that much of this struggle, as I was saying right now, is not really due to the fact that it's so atrociously difficult to find any glimpse of meaning anywhere to say, look, I found it. But that if you simply get into reality, you will find that meaning, right? That's also why he was successful in his advice, because there is this thing. One is prescriptional, is what tells to people that is tidy up your room and start doing better stuff every day and see what happens, right? And then it's as if then people came back to him and said, I did this and that, and I succeeded where, as I was saying before, I don't think that most people are really succeeding. Maybe they are improving, benefiting, no doubt, but let's say from these ideas that should be spread everywhere, and they're much better than anything else that we are really finding. But they're somewhat banal also, as we've seen, because they don't give you the measure of how this is true. Again, I believe that history is the answer. That if you study history, you can give meaning to everybody, because you can see easily at which point of reality you are, right? How these directions, this currents have taken, like the whole problem of the 20th century. Peterson, aside from quoting Dostoevsky, etc., doesn't go much back further. He doesn't talk about the 18th century, for example, before. He just talks about mass society fundamentally. And he doesn't, this is the point, that he's struggling for so much meaning when it would be very useful to have just an historical, let's say a continuity in the historical vision, starting from, let's say, the times where he talks about the Bible or Hellenic mythology and all these things, reconnecting them to the present. It's that this is a typically Western, especially Anglo-Saxon, speaking of the Anglosphere, Canada, etc., in case of Peterson, that is being, in my opinion, heavily influenced by materialism and a sort of scientism in the academies. That is to say, socio-economical factors maybe to interpret history, but then, wow, we have discovered there is also history of thought. And still, this history of thought is not taught diachronically, completely, because in those academic environments, they're not habituated to do that. They don't see the whole stripe from the beginning to the end. They just see, oh, look, that thinker thought that, this thinker thought that too, and then they don't connect the dots because they don't know what's effectively in between, or how to have this comprehensive explanations. Maybe me that has spent a lot of time with these ideas of having a kind of a more general idea of world history, not much in the sense of the world per se, because there are also people who study global history, but frankly they don't get very far because they make just a gross oversimplification of mostly trying to compare cultures that have more or less nothing to each other, and they just approximate, they just really see things from too much of a in fact a global rarefied perspective. I have studied, as you know, mostly for a long time, because at university from a decade, I finished, as you know, and I'm keeping to research in the field, etc. And but also in the previous decade, I've learned quite a thing, in high school, middle school, even before. I read mythology myself when I was a child, so it's as if I spent my entire life so far learning this stuff. And the and to me, it's always, I mean, this idea of the history continuity has always been central, right? It may be for others, it's not. Like I see it even among my colleagues, even from our, more common national background that is different from, it could be the Canadian one, etc. That we are more focused towards that perspective, in fact, that still most just don't care, because most are just working to eat, right? And that is important. So they don't care about having to do more than what it takes in order to have a more comprehensive understanding. And that's the price that I'm asking you. Asking you also, of course, everybody, myself first of all, that Peterson's followers were willing to pay, right? To properly realize that you must go underwater at some point in apnea in order to get something, that you can't just stay afloat and pretending that you don't have to make the effort of doing anything else, just making the minimum and being content with that. That I think is the biggest problem. So in other words, even intellectually, and I will shoot kind of this pretty serious thing now, I don't think Peterson is doing intellectually enough. I think he mostly repeats himself. I think he mostly doesn't keep looking into something that is the true reality, right? That is the one you can see historically. He hardly ever speak about history. He is surely much more competent than many others, way above me, of course, in any possible way, in clinical psychology, in evolutionary biology, no doubt. But is that all? Right? Do you want to study the theory, but you don't see the practice of how humans interact? It is a big problem. You study humans, you want to know how their biology is, but you don't even see how, the world has been working in some detail at some point. Because to me, it was dramatically easy to understand the importance of a hierarchy just by studying politics, society, and war. And I didn't even have to listen to Peterson or to any other external influence to have gotten there by myself. And it's so easy. And I'm also very young, after all. So I don't know. I think that there is so much to know, right? Another thing is not to be too connected to what other people say. I like Peterson because he is he's kind of a leader and a follower at the same time. I think, meaning that he's a leader in his own way, he makes his own path, but he also listens to, he's a person who is able to have some models to follow, some names, I'm not like that personally. I just can say if I'm a leader myself, but I'm surely a person who makes his own path. It doesn't follow anybody, right? I study von Clausewitz may be the only person I follow in the sense that I follow his method, but not because I have an altar with somebody that I follow, right? I don't trust philosophers. I studied too much philosophy to know that at some point they were just approximations, different viewpoints. It can be useful, but they don't make you get, because of the individual philosophical point, anywhere just per se. They should be a mean to an end, a tool, right, to strengthen your arsenal, but not really an end. So I don't tribute, also this may be a difference with the Anglosphere, that I don't tribute a special value to scholarship as opposed to sources. To me, sources are much more important, and sources can be individual people, of course, but in the sense I'm talking about evidence. To me, the view of history that I built for myself, I didn't build because somebody told me. In fact, these things I'm talking about, frankly, I don't know any person who has ever told anything like this. No one. I despise most historiographers that we are mostly brought to study. They were also mostly from a Marxist perspective, but they were also good historians. So you're going to say Marxist, not saying they're just your trash. It means just you're pretty confused person that has a pretty, narrow view on certain issues, but this doesn't mean they still can't have learned a lot on other grounds and still make more sensible points than others. There's no problem. The point is that my ultimate goal, and where I personally search for meaning, is the reconstruction of reality. So this can pass through information that of course is mediated, but the ultimate purpose is looking beyond the medium to see what reality was concretely. That's why I studied history. I could have never studied philosophy in this sense, even if I liked it, because I would have just studied other people's ideas, and that thing I don't like at all. I like to study reality, not in a realistic perspective. I don't believe in realism. That's why I think every reconstructionism or doesn't have basically almost any value for the historical sake. I believe that history is an existential condition, and that the ultimate goal is not lying to yourself or to be fed by others fundamentally, but just having your point of view on how things actually are. And I found out in my life, even just meeting other historians in my path, etc., that this doesn't seem to be the case. Most historians seem to be just concluded in their own niche, and they their own topic, their own obsession. It becomes just a fetish, like an idol, and it stops there. I'm not like that. I'm a medievalist. I don't give a shit about the Middle Ages per se. Well, first of all, because they never existed, but secondly, because I need to know the rest of history, even for the Middle Ages to make any sense, and vice versa. And this approach is completely skipped. I never found it anywhere, right? So I don't want to say like I'm unique in this. I'm sure there's plenty of people out there that don't let themselves be known. Many historians that have the same opinion, for that matter. It's just that I've never met it. Never met it in my environment. I've never met it on the internet. I don't see it in popular culture altogether. That's why I speak about these things, and I think they are important. And that's why when I look at Peterson and I say, wow, this is kind of a lead for so many people. Yeah, I understand that and I sympathize, but I still think that if one just scratches beyond the surface, can find so much more meaning just through the stuff that we have already created that the guy is not addressing, because it's not addressing history. And history remains this kind of foggy thing for most people altogether, because just they don't care very much about that. So following one thought of a scholar, of a writer, of a biographer is, in my opinion, not enough. Right? You can't properly do that. You should be able. This is where you can find meaning, in reconstructing reality. That is the thing that we are all doing in a way, but we're not doing properly with the scientific tools that history normally equips you with. If you deal with it seriously, that doesn't stop to, again, reading somebody's opinion, but is trying to finding out whether that opinion was right or wrong. And that I can't say about anybody, right? In fact, my first concern every time I speak here is saying, is what I'm saying, it can't be true, right? It's always the consequence, the result of an approximation of some kind. But at the same time, I try to maintain the balance so that people can say, well, this guy's kind of making sense of things. Like, it's not just saying something, but he's, thinking about the relevance of it. Like how this can serve a practical purpose. And to me, that purpose has unavoidably gone in the direction that Peterson has, because I believe it's the only possible direction. Like, there are not really others, that all the others are kind of deviations to paths that lead nowhere, and in fact haven't really produced anything. It's just we're leaving for specific, again, historical reasons in a moment of a radical disorientation that can be extremely dangerous, because the situation could simply escape our control quite quickly, and I think we're seeing it right now. And I had predicted these things in the past years. I was sure that something would go on in this direction. In fact, and I can tell it's not good news, because I don't think things are just we were unlucky, right? As a matter of fact, I think we've been terribly lucky so far. And that's a risk that also Peterson agrees on when he says, about the risks of prosperity just per se. And surely, so first of all, I would like to say that again, I'm very a great fan of Peterson, even though, as I was saying before, I'm not really a follower in the broader sense. I just like what he does very much, and just I respect his ideas. It's just I don't agree with all of them in measure, and in some degree of quality. But for the rest, I agree with the pattern. I do strongly, and that's why I urge you like to listen to what he says, because he especially for younger people, it can really be a very healthy, useful guide in a world that is going downhill at so many levels from a moral point of view. And so any criticism that I made in this video, I would like to talk to him, to invite him in the podcast, which would be great, as a matter of fact, but I don't think I will ever be, he will ever reach out, or I will ever manage to contact him or anything. I've never done it, but let's say, given the average stuff that it discuss there, these ideas could have some value, and I'd like to discuss it with him if I ever had the possibility. But I will simply go on with my path, and I have so much work to do. So I know what I'm doing, and I thank Peterson for this so much, because in part he helped me as well. So I surely benefited from his help in many ways. It wasn't like a point of reference in my life, but I learned a lot of things, and they were very interesting. I never thought of them. Without him, probably I would have never come across them, and this happens all the time. And so, yeah, so I'm very thankful, and I hope this video doesn't sound like a terrible criticism. It's just, again, I want to be fair so that we can fix things that do not work. And so I know that probably there's many of you who followed him and can relate even to things he says, and evaluate what I'm talking about. Alright, for today we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. I thank you heartily for listening to me. See you next time. Bye.